Welcome to the world of darkness where nightmares inhabit your dreams. I've noticed YouTube's algorithm hides my stories. Your interaction is the only way to reach new listeners. If these stories frighten you, please like, subscribe, and activate notifications. Any comment, however brief, helps spread my stories to other horror fans. Now relax, close your eyes, and let the rain wash away your thoughts as I guide you through tonight's terrifying tale. The crisp Montana air filled my lungs as I packed the last of my gear into my weathered Ford F-150. October in Big Sky Country meant unpredictable weather, but the forecast promised clear skies for at least the first few days of my trip. Perfect conditions for what I needed: solitude, silence, and a chance to clear my head. My name is Dustin Mitchell Yearsome, a 35-year-old contractor with my own small business in Bozeman. Life had been a whirlwind lately, juggling building projects, caring for my 8-year-old daughter Madeline, and helping raise my 14-year-old stepson Trevor when they stayed with me. The divorce 2 years ago had been amicable enough, but the constant back and forth was wearing me down. This solo camping trip to Moose Creek was long overdue. "You sure about going alone, Dust?" My brother Wyatt leaned against my truck, concern evident in his expression. Weather can turn quick this time of year. I secured the last strap on my gear. Been planning this for months, why? Besides, I won't be completely alone. Brett's joining me for the last couple days. Brett Holloway had been my friend since high school, one of the few who stuck around after the divorce. "Just keep your satellite phone charged," Wyatt said, tossing me a small solar charger. "New toy. Consider it an early birthday present." "Thanks, brother." We embraced briefly, the way men do when they're uncomfortable with displays of emotion, but feel them deeply anyway. As I drove north toward the Gallatin National Forest, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the highway. The mountains loomed dark against the sky, beautiful, imposing, unconcerned with human troubles. I'd camped and hunted these areas for years, but something about this trip felt different. Looking back, I wonder if some part of me sensed what was coming. The turnoff to Moose Creek appeared after nearly 2 hours of driving. The dirt road narrowed as I climbed higher, patches of early snow dotting the shadowed areas beneath tall pines. My chosen campsite was remote, about 3 miles from the nearest frequently used trail. Privacy was what I craved. The sun was setting as I parked in a small clearing and began unloading. I worked efficiently, setting up my 4-season tent, arranging the campsite, and gathering firewood before darkness fell completely. The first fire of the trip crackled to life as stars emerged overhead, impossibly bright away from city lights. I heated a simple dinner of chili and cornbread, savoring the quiet broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or rustle in the underbrush. This was why I came. No phone calls, no client meetings, no complicated custody arrangements, just me and the mountains. That first night I slept better than I had in months, lulled by the absolute darkness and the gentle rhythm of wind through pine boughs. I couldn't have known it would be one of my last peaceful nights alive. Dawn broke with the muted colors of early October, pale pinks and oranges staining the eastern sky. I woke refreshed, eager to explore the surrounding wilderness. After a quick breakfast of instant coffee and oatmeal, I packed a day bag with essentials: water, jerky, a topographical map, first aid kit, and my trusted hunting knife. The trail I chose wound through dense forest before opening onto a ridge with spectacular views of the valley below. Golden aspen leaves trembled in the breeze, creating a flickering mosaic against the darker evergreens. I had the path entirely to myself, or so I thought. About 4 miles in, I noticed boot prints in a muddy section of trail. Nothing unusual about other hikers, but something about the pattern caught my attention. They appeared and disappeared at odd intervals, sometimes cutting straight through underbrush instead of following the path. Curious, but not alarming. I stopped for lunch at a small alpine lake, its surface perfectly mirroring the surrounding peaks. As I sat on a sun-warmed rock, movement on the opposite shore caught my eye. A figure stood partially obscured by trees, watching. I raised my hand in the universal hiker's greeting, but they didn't respond. When I blinked, they were gone. Probably just another solo hiker, I muttered to myself, but unease crept through me like cold water. On my return to camp, I twice had the distinct sensation of being followed. I'd stop, listen to the profound silence, then hear a twig snap or stones shift just after I resumed walking. Each time I turned, I saw nothing but empty trail behind me. The campsite appeared undisturbed when I returned in late afternoon. I busied myself gathering more firewood, trying to shake the feeling of being observed. The forest felt different now, less welcoming, more secretive. Shadows seemed to linger longer than they should. That evening, as I cooked a simple dinner over my camp stove, I heard a rustling approach from the direction of the access road. I reached for my hunting knife, tension coiling in my muscles. "Hello?" I called, relieved when the response came in a human voice. "Hey there! Got room for another camper?" A man emerged from the trees, mid-40s, lean, with a scraggly beard and worn hiking gear. He carried a small pack and had a friendly, if somewhat intense, smile. "I'm Darren," he said, extending his hand. "Saw your smoke and thought I'd say hello. Been hiking solo for a few days now." Something in his manner made me hesitate, but wilderness etiquette is strong in Montana. You don't turn away fellow outdoorsmen without good reason. "Dustin," I replied, shaking his hand. "I've got plenty of space. Fire's just getting going." "Appreciate it," Darren said, dropping his pack near, but not too near, my camp. "Got any beers in that cooler? Happy to trade some jerky I made myself." I offered him a beer, which he accepted eagerly. As night fell, we exchanged the usual camper's talk. Good trails in the area, weather forecasts, brief mentions of life back in civilization. Darren claimed to be from Missoula, working odd construction jobs, something we had in common. "Love it out here," he said, staring into the fire. "Away from people. People can be disappointing, you know?" "Sometimes," I agreed cautiously. "That's why we escape occasionally." His eyes reflected the flames when he looked up. "But we can't really escape, can we? Not from ourselves?" The conversation grew increasingly uncomfortable as night deepened. Darren's questions became more personal. Did I come here often? Was anyone expecting me? Did I have family nearby? I answered vaguely, instinct warning me to keep details to myself. When he finally retreated to set up his small tent about 50 yards from mine, I exhaled tension I hadn't realized I was holding. I secured everything valuable in my truck and double-checked that my hunting knife was within reach before zipping myself into my tent. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by sounds that might have been normal forest noises, or might have been someone moving around my campsite. Each time I started to drift off, I'd jerk awake, certain I'd heard footsteps circling my tent. By morning, I'd made my decision. Friendly Montana hospitality had its limits. I would break camp and find another site deeper in the wilderness, where unexpected visitors were less likely to find me. The pre-dawn light painted everything in shades of gray as I emerged from my tent. To my surprise, Darren's small campsite was already dismantled. No sign of him except for compressed grass where his tent had stood. Relief washed over me. Perhaps he'd sensed my discomfort and moved on. I made coffee and considered my options. Moving camp meant losing a day of hiking, but the thought of another night with unexpected visitors made the decision easy. I'd head northwest, toward a small plateau I remembered from hunting trips years ago. It was accessible only by a faint game trail and offered excellent views of approaching visitors. By mid-morning, I had packed everything except my tent and was doing a final sweep of the campsite when I heard vehicle tires on the access road. I tensed, then relaxed when a familiar forest green Jeep appeared. Brett Holloway wasn't due for 2 more days, but his early arrival was welcome. "Dust," Brett called, climbing out with his characteristic grin. His solid 6-foot frame and booming voice always made him seem larger than he was. "Surprise! Got my projects wrapped early and thought I'd head up before the weather turns." I abandoned my plans to relocate and helped Brett unload his gear. Having a trusted friend in camp instantly dispelled my unease about the previous night's visitor. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Brett commented as we set up his tent. "Woods got you jumpy already?" I debated whether to mention Darren, then decided against it. In daylight, with Brett's reassuring presence, my concerns seemed overblown. "Just didn't sleep great. Had some wildlife circling camp last night." We spent the day hiking to a nearby waterfall, falling into the easy rhythm of old friendship. Brett talked about his latest carpentry project. I shared stories about Madeline's recent soccer victories. The normality was comforting, and by evening, Darren seemed like nothing more than a strange encounter to laugh about, until we returned to camp and found everything destroyed. My tent had been slashed repeatedly, the fabric hanging in ribbons. Our coolers were upended, contents scattered. Brett's backpack had been emptied, his clothes flung into the surrounding brush. Most disturbing were the deep gouges in my truck's doors, straight lines clearly made by a blade, not animal claws. "What the hell?" Brett whispered, instinctively moving back to back with me as we surveyed the damage. "You think it's bears?" "No bear did this," I said, pointing to the methodical slashes in my tent. "This was deliberate." We searched the surrounding area carefully, finding no sign of the perpetrator. No footprints, no dropped items, just the deliberate destruction of our camp. "We should leave," Brett urged, already gathering what remained of his belongings. "Report this to the rangers on our way out." I hesitated. "It's probably that guy from last night, Darren. Seemed off, but I didn't think he'd do something like this." "All the more reason to go," Brett insisted. "This is serious, Dust. Someone sending a message." As I reluctantly agreed, the setting sun gleamed on something metallic near the fire pit. I approached cautiously and felt my stomach drop. My hunting knife, which I was certain I'd packed in my day bag that morning, was stuck blade first into a log. Beneath it was a scrap of paper with 5 words scrawled in charcoal. "I'm still watching you, Dustin." Brett's face paled when I showed him. "We're leaving. Now." We hastily packed what we could salvage into my truck. As I turned the key, I glanced at the rearview mirror and froze. A figure stood motionless at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden by shadows. Before I could point it out to Brett, it withdrew into the darkness. "Someone's out there," I said quietly, putting the truck in gear. Brett strained to see through the gathering darkness. "I don't see anything. Let's just go." The truck's headlights cut through the forest as we navigated the narrow access road. Each curve revealed only more trees, more shadows where someone could hide. The 3-mile drive to the main forest road felt interminable. We were nearly at the junction when the truck's engine suddenly sputtered and died. "This isn't happening," I muttered, turning the key again. The engine cranked but wouldn't catch. Brett immediately pulled out his phone, though we both knew there would be no service this deep in the forest. "Engine was fine on the drive in," I said, trying to keep the rising panic from my voice. I popped the hood and grabbed the flashlight from the glove compartment. The beam revealed the problem immediately. The fuel line had been cleanly cut, a small puddle of gasoline still forming beneath the truck. This was no accident or mechanical failure. "Someone sabotaged us," I said, showing Brett the damage. "Recently, too. We're leaking fuel." Brett's normally jovial face hardened. "So they wanted us stranded out here. Question is, do we stay with the truck or hike out?" Night had fallen completely now. The darkness between trees absolute. The main road was still over 2 miles away, and from there, it would be at least 15 miles to the ranger station or any hope of cell service. Staying put makes us easy targets, I reasoned. But hiking out means we're vulnerable and separated from whatever supplies we have left. After quick deliberation, we decided to gather essential supplies into our packs, hide the rest in the truck, and hike to the main road. From there, we'd reassess, possibly continuing to the ranger station or flagging down a passing vehicle. We moved swiftly and silently, flashlights pointed downward to preserve our night vision. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf made us pause, hearts hammering. The knowledge that someone was out there watching and waiting transformed the familiar forest into a labyrinth of potential threats. About half a mile from the truck, Brett suddenly grabbed my arm, stopping me in my tracks. He pointed silently to our left. Through the trees, barely visible, was the glow of a small fire. "Could be another camper," I whispered hopefully. Brett shook his head. "Nobody camps this far off trail, and after what happened..." We debated approaching, the possibility of help warring with the certainty of danger. Curiosity and desperation won out. We circled wide, approaching the light from downwind, moving with exaggerated care. The small clearing came into view gradually. A campfire burned low, illuminating a simple setup: a bedroll, a small pack, and some cooking equipment. No tent, no vehicle nearby. The camper was nowhere to be seen. "I don't like this," Brett whispered. "Feels like a trap." As if summoned by his words, a branch snapped behind us. We whirled, Brett raising his walking stick defensively. The beam of my flashlight caught movement between trees about 30 yards back. A human figure ducking out of sight. "Hey!" I called, abandoning stealth. "We know you're there." Silence answered, heavy and threatening. Then, a low laugh echoed through the trees, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You boys lost?" The voice was unmistakably Darren's, but distorted somehow, filled with malicious amusement. "Truck trouble?" "What do you want?" I demanded, trying to pinpoint his location as Brett and I backed toward the fire. "Just some company," Darren replied, closer now. "Gets lonely out here. Thought we could spend some quality time together before your trip's over." The way he emphasized "over" sent ice through my veins. "We're expected back tomorrow," Brett lied smoothly. "People know where we are." Another laugh, this one closer to a giggle. "No, they don't. You told your brother Wyatt you'd be gone 5 days. And Brett here, well, he wasn't supposed to arrive until the day after tomorrow. Nobody's looking for you yet." The realization that he knew our names, our plans, hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't random. He'd been watching me, learning about me, for who knows how long. "The Rangers have our wilderness permit information," I countered, continuing to back toward the fire where we'd at least have visibility. "Park rangers are busy with a missing hiker near Yellowstone," Darren said casually. "Called in the report myself yesterday. Very convincing." We reached the fire, the small circle of light offering no real protection but at least eliminating some shadows. Brett positioned himself, so we stood back to back, scanning the darkness. "Show yourself," Brett demanded. "What the hell do you want from us?" "I want to play a game," Darren replied, his voice now coming from a different direction entirely. "It's called survival. Rules are simple. You run, I hunt. If you make it to the ranger station alive, you win. If not..." He let the sentence hang unfinished. "We're not playing your sick game," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the fear clawing at my throat. "You already are," Darren whispered, suddenly much closer. The attack came with shocking speed. A figure lunged from the darkness directly at Brett, swinging something that flashed in the firelight. Brett managed to partially deflect the blow with his walking stick, but the impact knocked him sideways. I caught a glimpse of Darren's face, eyes wide with excitement, mouth stretched in a grotesque grin, before he disappeared again into the darkness. Brett stumbled, clutching his arm where blood already darkened his jacket sleeve. "He's got an axe," he gasped. "Game starts now," Darren called from somewhere in the darkness. "I'll give you a 5-minute head start. Better use it wisely." We had no choice. Grabbing what supplies we could from around the fire, a water bottle, a small first aid kit, we plunged into the forest, heading roughly northeast toward where we believed the main road lay. The forest closed around us like a tomb. Branches whipped at our faces as we ran, the beam of my single flashlight bouncing wildly ahead of us. Brett's breath came in harsh gasps beside me, his injured arm clutched tight against his body. I had hastily wrapped it with a bandana, but blood was already soaking through. "We need to find water," I panted as we paused behind a massive fallen tree. "A stream or creek. It'll mask our trail and give us direction." Brett nodded grimly, his face pale in the dim light. "There's a creek that feeds into Moose Creek about half a mile east. If we can reach it, we can follow it north to the main road." We moved more carefully now, trying to balance speed with silence. Every few minutes we'd pause to listen, ears straining for any sound of pursuit. The forest was unnaturally quiet. No owls, no rustling of nocturnal animals. Just our labored breathing and the occasional snap of twigs beneath our boots. The ground began to slope downward, and soon we heard the faint gurgle of flowing water. Relief surged through me as we stumbled toward the sound. The creek was narrow but swift-moving, its black surface occasionally catching moonlight that filtered through the canopy. "We need to treat your wound properly," I said, helping Brett to a sitting position on a rock by the water's edge. "No time," Brett argued, wincing as I carefully removed the soaked bandana. He could be right behind us. The gash was deep but clean, running about 4 inches along his upper arm. Using the small first aid kit we'd grabbed, I cleaned and dressed it as best I could, finishing with a pressure bandage to slow the bleeding. "It needs stitches," I said grimly. "It needs us to survive the night," Brett countered, forcing himself to stand. "Which way is north?" I checked my watch compass. "That way, following the creek downstream." We waded into the icy water, wincing at the cold but grateful for the protection it offered from leaving tracks. The creek bed was slippery with moss-covered rocks, forcing us to move slowly to avoid falls that could leave us even more vulnerable. After about 20 minutes of painful progress, a sound froze us in place, a distant, sing-song voice carrying through the trees. "Dustin, Brett, where are my new friends hiding?" Darren was following and closer than we'd hoped. We pressed ourselves against the creek bank, trying to blend into the shadows as his voice grew gradually louder. "I'm disappointed in you boys," he called, his voice echoing strangely in the night air. "The creek? Really? So predictable. Might as well have left a trail of breadcrumbs." A beam of light swept the trees about 100 yards behind us, moving methodically back and forth as Darren searched. We crouched lower in the water, the cold seeping into our bones, but fear preventing any movement that might give us away. "Let me tell you what happens next," Darren continued conversationally, as if we were sitting around a campfire sharing stories. "Most people in your situation make one of 2 mistakes. They either exhaust themselves trying to outrun me all night, or they find what they think is a good hiding spot and stay put, hoping I'll pass them by." The light beam swung closer, illuminating the creek bed about 50 yards away. "The runners always collapse eventually, hypothermia, exhaustion, or they injure themselves in the dark. The hiders," he laughed, "they just make my job easier, like shooting fish in a barrel." Brett gripped my arm, pointing silently to a narrow deer trail leading away from the creek on the opposite bank. It was a risk. Leaving the water meant leaving tracks, but staying put with Darren approaching was certain death. Moving with agonizing slowness to avoid splashing, we crossed to the far bank and crawled up the muddy slope. The undergrowth was dense enough to provide cover, but every movement seemed thunderously loud to my terrified ears. "I can smell your fear," Darren called, his light now playing across the spot we'd occupied just moments before. "The wounded always leave a scent." We froze, hardly daring to breathe, as Darren's shadowy figure appeared at the creek's edge. He stood motionless, sweeping his light across the water, then up both banks. For a heart-stopping moment, the beam passed directly over our position, but the thick underbrush must have concealed us sufficiently. Darren waded into the creek, moving upstream rather than down, Smart move, he muttered, just loud enough for us to hear. But it only delays the inevitable. We remained motionless until his light disappeared around a bend in the creek. Only then did we continue along the deer trail, moving as quickly as we dared through the pitch-black forest, guided only by occasional glimpses of stars through the canopy. "He's toying with us," Brett whispered, as we paused to rest in a small clearing. "He could have infrared, night vision gear for all we know." "Why, though?" I asked. The question that had been burning since this nightmare began. "Why us? Why me?" Brett shook his head. "Some people don't need a reason, Dust. They're just wired wrong." As if to punctuate his statement, a scream tore through the night, not human, but the shriek of an animal in mortal pain. It came from somewhere behind us, in the direction Darren had gone. "He's killing something," Brett whispered, "sending a message." We pushed on, the deer trail eventually widening into what appeared to be an old logging path. Our pace increased on the clearer ground, hope rising that we might actually reach the main road before dawn. That hope died as the path abruptly ended at a sheer rock face, a cliff stretching at least 60 feet upward, with no obvious way around. We'd been following a box canyon, not a trail to freedom. Brett sagged against a tree, exhaustion and blood loss evident in his pale face. "We can't go back," he stated flatly. "He'll be waiting." I examined the cliff face in the dim light. "We climb," I decided, running my hands over the rock surface. "There are enough handholds. It's our only option." Brett looked dubiously at his injured arm, then at the imposing cliff. "You go," he said quietly. "Get help. I'll hide nearby and keep him occupied if he shows up." "No," I said firmly. "We stick together. I'll help you." The argument that followed was brief but intense, ended only by a sound that made our blood freeze. Darren's voice, much closer than should have been possible. "Found you." We spun toward the voice, backs against the cliff face. Darren stood at the mouth of the box canyon, his silhouette unmistakable in the faint moonlight. The distance between us, perhaps 50 yards, offered no comfort. In his right hand gleamed the axe, its edge catching what little light filtered through the trees. "Nowhere left to run," he observed casually, taking a deliberate step forward. "But I'll give you credit. You lasted longer than most." Brett straightened beside me, somehow finding reserves of strength. "What do you want from us?" he demanded. Darren tilted his head, considering the question as if it were genuinely interesting. "Want? I want to feel something, I suppose. Life gets so monotonous. But this," he gestured with the axe, "this makes everything crystal clear. In these moments, I'm fully alive. And you are too, aren't you? More alive than you've ever been." He was insane. The realization brought strange clarity. There would be no reasoning with him, no appeal to humanity or mercy that would reach whatever broken thing existed inside him. "We need to split up," I whispered to Brett, my eyes never leaving Darren's approaching figure. "Give one of us a chance." "Both of you die tonight," Darren called, as if hearing my words. "But I'm not unreasonable. I'll make a deal. Whoever reaches me first gets the quicker death. The other—" he shrugged. "Well, I like to take my time." Brett and I exchanged a glance. A lifetime of friendship condensed into one look. No words were needed. We both understood what had to happen. "Now!" I shouted, and we bolted in opposite directions. Brett toward the left side of the canyon, me toward the right. The plan was desperate. Force Darren to choose which of us to pursue, giving the other a chance to circle behind him and escape back up the path. Darren hesitated only a moment before turning toward Brett, perhaps seeing him as the easier target due to his injury. I ran harder, aiming to circle wide through the trees and come up behind our pursuer. The forest floor was treacherous in the darkness, roots and rocks threatening to send me sprawling with each step. Behind me, I heard Brett shouting, drawing Darren's attention, buying me precious seconds. Then came sounds no one should ever have to hear. The meaty thunk of blade meeting flesh, a strangled cry cut horribly short, Grief and rage propelled me forward, but survival instinct kept me from turning back. Brett had made his choice. The best way to honor it was to escape, to ensure his sacrifice wasn't in vain. I reached the canyon entrance and hurtled up the path we'd descended earlier, no longer concerned with silence or tracking. Pure adrenaline drove me through the darkness, branches tearing at my face and clothes as I ran blindly forward. Behind me came crashing sounds, Darren pursuing at a run. He was no longer playing, no longer toying with his prey. The game had changed to simple predator and prey. "You can't outrun me, Dustin," he called, his voice tight with excitement. "Your friend died screaming. Want to know what his last words were?" I blocked out his taunts, focusing solely on putting distance between us. The path began to climb steeply, my lungs burning with exertion. Ahead, through gaps in the trees, I caught glimpses of a steep ridge. If I could reach it, perhaps I could find a defensible position or a route too difficult for Darren to follow quickly. The trees thinned as I neared the ridge, moonlight suddenly illuminating the terrain. I realized too late it was a mixed blessing. I could see where I was going, but Darren could see me more easily as well. The ridge was steeper than I'd hoped, a near vertical scramble of loose shale and stunted trees. I began climbing anyway, rocks slipping beneath my boots, hands grasping desperately for any solid hold. "Running uphill?" Darren laughed below me. "Tiring yourself out? That's a new one." I didn't respond, saving my breath for the climb. About 20 feet up, I reached a narrow ledge, barely wide enough to stand on, but offering a moment's respite. Looking down, I saw Darren begin his own ascent, moving with the casual confidence of someone who had done this many times before. Panic threatened to overwhelm me. I couldn't outclimb him, couldn't outrun him, but perhaps. My hand closed around a baseball-sized rock on the ledge. I waited, timing my move carefully as Darren climbed closer. When he was about 10 feet below, I hurled the rock with all my strength, aiming for his head. He jerked sideways with inhuman speed, but the rock still caught him on the shoulder, sending him sliding several feet down the shale slope. He recovered quickly, a new emotion crossing his face, anger replacing the playful bloodlust. "First one to draw blood," he acknowledged, rotating his shoulder, "but that's all you get." I scrambled higher as he resumed his pursuit, searching desperately for any advantage the terrain might offer. The ridge continued upward for perhaps another 100 feet, the top lost in darkness. No way to know what waited above, possible escape, or a dead end even worse than the box canyon. Halfway up, disaster struck. A handhold I'd trusted crumbled under my weight, sending me tumbling backward. I slid several yards down the loose shale before managing to arrest my fall by digging my fingers into the soil. Pain shot through my left ankle, not broken, but certainly sprained. Darren's laugh floated up from below. "Gravity's a bitch, isn't it? Stay put, I'll be right there." Desperation gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. I hauled myself upward, putting minimal weight on my injured ankle, moving on pure will alone. The ridge steepened further, forcing me to climb more than walk. Every movement sent waves of agony through my leg, but stopping meant death. Just as my strength began to fail, my hand grasped what felt like a tree root, but it was too straight, too smooth. A rope? I pulled myself up further and discovered an old climbing rope anchored to a metal spike driven deep into the rock. Someone had established a route here, perhaps years ago. Hope surged as I tested the rope. It held firm despite obvious weathering. Using it to assist my climb, I made faster progress up the increasingly vertical face. Below, Darren had noticed my discovery and was pushing harder to close the gap between us. The rope led upward into what appeared to be a narrow cleft in the ridgeline. As I pulled myself into it, my flashlight revealed what I'd found. Not a natural feature, but the remains of an old mining operation. A horizontal shaft extended into the ridge, timber supports creating a low tunnel barely tall enough to stand in. Without hesitation, I entered the mine shaft, moving as quickly as my injured ankle allowed. The air grew stale and cold, the beam of my flashlight illuminating rusty tools and rotting support beams. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness ahead, the sound echoing ominously. I paused about 20 feet in, listening intently. Scrabbling sounds from the entrance told me Darren had reached the rope and was following. A plan, desperate and dangerous, formed in my mind. Switching off my flashlight, I pressed myself against the wall of the tunnel, watching the entrance. Soon, Darren's silhouette appeared, backlit by the faint pre-dawn sky. "Clever," he called into the darkness. "But mines have no exit, Dustin. You've trapped yourself." He flicked on his own light, the beam sweeping the tunnel as he cautiously entered. I remained motionless, barely breathing, as he moved past my position. When he was about 10 feet beyond me, I made my move. Lunging forward, I grabbed one of the support beams and pulled with all my remaining strength. Years of decay had done their work. The timber cracked and gave way, bringing down a section of the tunnel ceiling. Earth and rock cascaded between us as I turned and sprinted toward the entrance, ignoring the screaming pain in my ankle. Behind me, Darren roared in fury as he realized what I'd done. I didn't look back, didn't stop to see if the collapse had trapped him or merely delayed him. The shaft entrance appeared ahead, gray dawn light beckoning like salvation. I burst out onto the ridge, the cool morning air filling my lungs. The eastern sky was lightening, silhouetting the mountains with the promise of sunrise. Looking down the way I'd come, I could see for miles, including, in the far distance, what had to be the main forest road winding through the valley. No time to celebrate. I began descending the ridge on the opposite side from where we'd climbed, using trees and shrubs to control my speed. Each step on my injured ankle was agony, but the alternative, waiting for Darren to dig his way out or find another exit, was unthinkable. The descent was treacherous, but gravity worked in my favor now. Within 20 minutes, I reached the valley floor, the terrain leveling into dense forest once more. My pace slowed, exhaustion and injury taking their toll, but I pushed onward in the direction I believed would lead to the road. A sound from behind stole what little hope I'd mustered. Distant but distinct. Darren's voice, calling my name. Impossibly, he had escaped the mine collapse and was on my trail once more. The realization should have crushed my spirit, but instead, a strange calm settled over me. I had been running for hours, fear driving me beyond normal human endurance. There would be no more running. The forest opened into a small meadow, early morning mist clinging to the tall grass. At the center stood a massive Douglas fir, its lower branches creating a natural shelter. I limped toward it, an idea forming. Not a plan for escape, but for confrontation. This would end here, one way or another. I gathered fallen branches as I approached the tree, piling them strategically. From my pack, I retrieved my last resources, a small bottle of alcohol-based hand sanitizer, a lighter, and my Swiss Army knife. Poor weapons against an axe-wielding maniac, but they were all I had. Darren's voice grew closer as I finished my preparations, ducking beneath the fir's lower branches to wait. His taunts had taken on a new edge, frustration mixing with the sadistic pleasure that had dominated earlier. "You're only making it worse for yourself," he called, close enough now that I could hear twigs snapping beneath his boots. I was going to be merciful, quick. Now I'm angry. The morning light strengthened, burning away some of the mist as Darren emerged at the meadow's edge. He looked different in daylight, smaller somehow, yet no less terrifying. Blood stained his clothing, Brett's blood, and dirt covered him from the mine collapse. The axe hung loosely in his right hand, its blade notched and dark with dried blood. He paused at the meadow's perimeter, scanning the open space with predatory focus. I remained motionless beneath the tree, watching through gaps in the branches. He hadn't spotted me yet, but it was only a matter of time. "I know you're close," he said, his voice deceptively conversational. "I can smell the blood from your ankle. Does it hurt, Dustin? It's going to hurt a lot more soon. He began circling the meadow, moving with the patience of someone who knew his prey was cornered. I tensed, fingers tightening around my knife. The blade was painfully inadequate against his axe, but surprise might give me a momentary advantage. As he approached my position, I squeezed a generous amount of hand sanitizer onto the pile of branches I'd arranged, then flicked the lighter. The alcohol caught immediately, flames leaping higher as they spread to the dry wood. What the? Darren spun toward the sudden blaze, momentarily distracted. I erupted from beneath the tree, launching myself at him with every ounce of strength remaining in my battered body. The impact knocked us both to the ground, my knife slashing wildly. I felt it connect, heard Darren's howl of pain as the blade sliced across his forearm. The victory was short-lived. He recovered with frightening speed, bucking me off and scrambling to his feet. My ankle gave way as I tried to stand, sending me crashing back to the ground. The knife flew from my grasp, landing in the tall grass several feet away. That, Darren said, touching the bleeding gash on his arm, was exceptionally stupid. He raised the axe, eyes glittering with rage and anticipation. I rolled desperately as the axe swung downward, the blade burying itself in the earth where my head had been seconds before. Darren wrenched it free, advancing as I scrabbled backward on hands and knees. Your friend died quickly, he said, swinging again and missing by inches as I continued my desperate retreat. A luxury you've forfeited. My back hit the trunk of the Douglas fir, nowhere left to go. Darren loomed over me, axe raised for the killing blow, his face split in a grotesque grin of triumph. The sound that saved me was so ordinary, so out of place in our life or death struggle, that we both froze in confusion. A car engine, followed by voices, human voices, carrying clearly through the morning air. Over here, I see smoke. Darren's head whipped toward the sound, his expression morphing from sadistic pleasure to animal fear. The Forest Service road must have been closer than I'd realized, and my fire had drawn attention. This isn't over, he hissed, backing away. We'll finish our game another time. He turned and sprinted toward the far side of the meadow, disappearing into the tree line just as shouts grew louder from the opposite direction. I collapsed against the tree, consciousness fading as figures emerged from the forest. Uniformed forest rangers, weapons drawn, running toward my position. The last thing I remembered was a woman's face hovering over mine, her voice urgent but distant as darkness claimed me. Stay with me, sir. Ambulance is on the way. You're safe now. But I wasn't safe. Not really. Not while Darren remained free. I woke to the sterile white ceiling of a hospital room, the steady beep of monitors and the antiseptic smell confirming I had survived. My body felt distant, pain dulled by what I assumed were powerful medications. A bandaged arm appeared in my peripheral vision, not mine, but belonging to someone seated beside the bed. Wyatt! My voice emerged as a croak. My brother jolted upright, relief washing over his haggard face. Dust, thank God. He fumbled for a call button. The doctor said you'd wake up today, but after 3 days... 3 days? The words felt wrong in my mouth, disconnected from reality. A nurse appeared, followed shortly by a doctor who performed a brief examination, asking simple questions to assess my condition. When they left, promising to return soon, Wyatt filled in the gaps in my memory. The Forest Service found you Thursday morning. A couple of rangers on routine patrol saw your fire. You were in bad shape. Dehydration, exposure. That ankle's got 3 torn ligaments, but you'll recover fully. Brett? I asked, though I already knew the answer from the grief in Wyatt's eyes. They found him late Thursday, down in a canyon about 2 miles from where they found you. He swallowed hard. I'm sorry, Dust. The door opened again, admitting 2 unfamiliar figures, a tall, stern-faced woman in a sheriff's uniform, and a shorter man in plainclothes who immediately produced a badge. Mr. Yersom, the man said, I'm Detective Holt, Gallatin County Sheriff's Office. This is Sheriff Callahan. We need to ask you some questions about what happened in Moose Creek, if you're up to it. I nodded, the movement sending dull pain through my skull. Did you catch him? Darren? The officers exchanged glances. We've been searching the area since Thursday, Sheriff Callahan said. No sign of anyone matching the description you gave the Rangers before you lost consciousness. He's still out there, I whispered, cold fear slicing through the medication's haze. We need you to tell us everything, Detective Holt said, pulling out a recorder. Start from the beginning. I recounted the entire nightmare. Meeting Darren at my campsite, the destruction of our camp, the pursuit through the forest, Brett's sacrifice, the mine shaft, and the final confrontation in the meadow. As I spoke, Detective Holt took notes while Sheriff Callahan's expression grew increasingly troubled. When I finished, an uncomfortable silence filled the room. Finally, Detective Holt cleared his throat. Mr. Yersom, we've checked regional databases for anyone matching your description of this Darren. Nothing. No fingerprints at your campsite except yours and Mr. Holloway's. No evidence of a third person at all. What are you saying? Wyatt demanded, his protective instincts flaring. You think my brother made this up? Of course not, Sheriff Callahan intervened smoothly. But trauma can affect memory. The medical examiner believes Mr. Holloway's wounds are consistent with a wildlife attack, possibly a mountain lion or bear. The implication hit me like a physical blow. You think an animal killed Brett? That's insane. I saw Darren attack him. I saw the axe. A physical examination showed you had a significant concussion, Detective Holt noted, his tone professionally neutral, along with severe sleep deprivation and the beginning stages of hypothermia, all of which can cause hallucinations or distorted perceptions. I struggled to sit up, ignoring the pain that knifed through various parts of my body. Then explain the destroyed campsite. Explain the cuts on my truck. Explain how I ended up miles from where we were camping if we were attacked by an animal. We've seen bizarre behavior from injured hikers before, Sheriff Callahan said gently. Disorientation, paranoia. People can travel remarkable distances in survival mode, even with serious injuries. The conversation continued in this vein for another 30 minutes, with the officers asking detailed questions that seemed designed to expose inconsistencies in my account. They were polite, even sympathetic, but their skepticism was palpable. When they finally left, promising to continue the investigation, Wyatt exploded. Unbelievable. They think you imagined the whole thing. They think I'm crazy, I corrected quietly, or that the trauma scrambled my memories. What about the guy you described, this Darren character? I shook my head. If they haven't found any evidence, he exists. My voice trailed off as a horrible possibility formed in my mind. What if they were right? What if my concussed hypothermic brain had constructed an elaborate narrative to explain a simple, tragic wildlife encounter? The human mind was capable of extraordinary self-deception when faced with trauma. But no, the memories were too vivid, too consistent. I remembered Darren's voice, his words, the methodical way he had hunted us. No animal could have slashed my tent with such precision, or carved those deliberate gouges in my truck. In the weeks that followed, I was released from the hospital and began the slow process of physical recovery. Brett's funeral was a blur of grief and guilt. His parents were gracious, absolving me of responsibility for their son's death, which somehow made the burden heavier. The official investigation concluded that Brett Holloway had been killed by a wildlife attack, most likely a mountain lion. My contradictory account was attributed to trauma-induced confabulation, a clinical term that essentially meant my brain had invented a human attacker to make sense of a random animal encounter. I tried to accept this explanation, to embrace the closure it offered. Life would be simpler if I believed Darren had never existed. But at night, alone in my apartment with the lights on and doors triple locked, I knew the truth. 2 months after the attack, a small package arrived at my door. No return address, no postmark. Someone had hand-delivered it. Inside was a single item, my hunting knife. the one I'd lost in the meadow during our final confrontation. Attached was a note containing 3 words in an unfamiliar handwriting: "Game not over." I reported it to Detective Holt, who took the package for evidence testing but called the next day with predictable results. No fingerprints, no DNA, nothing to connect it to any known suspect. He suggested, kindly but firmly, that I consider therapy for post-traumatic stress. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps professional help was the answer. But as I stared at the business card for the recommended therapist, another thought formed, a thought that would eventually become an obsession. If the authorities wouldn't believe me, if they couldn't or wouldn't find Darren, then the responsibility fell to me. He was out there, perhaps watching me even now, waiting to resume his game. Next time, I would be ready. I opened my laptop and began researching missing persons in national forests, unsolved deaths in wilderness areas, patterns that might reveal the hunting grounds of a predator who had evaded detection for who knows how long. The screen glowed in my darkened apartment as names and faces appeared: hikers, campers, solo travelers who had ventured into remote areas and never returned. How many of them had encountered Darren? How many had died believing help would come, not knowing they were merely pawns in his twisted game? Outside, the October wind rattled my windows as the first snow of the season began to fall. Somewhere in the darkness beyond, a killer waited, and I had become the hunter. I woke with a start, my heart racing in the stillness of my remote Alaskan cabin. Pale dawn light seeped through the windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. I, Jasper Holland, had retreated to this wilderness sanctuary months ago, seeking solitude to finish my latest novel. Normally, the tranquil surroundings, dense forests and a pristine lake perfect for fishing, brought me peace. But this morning, an unsettling sensation prickled at the back of my neck. I rose and began my morning routine, trying to shake off the unease. As I sipped my coffee, a knock sounded at the door. It was my neighbor, Deirdre Gallagher, her face ashen. "Jasper, have you heard the news?" Her normally cheerful voice wavered. "They found something awful in that old abandoned cabin in the woods. It's like a scene from a horror movie." Intrigued, I pressed for details, but Deirdre seemed reluctant to say more. My curiosity growing, I decided to investigate myself. I phoned my old friend Archibald Thurman, an avid hiker familiar with the area. Together we set off into the misty forest, the damp earth muffling our footsteps. The abandoned cabin emerged from the fog like an apparition. As we approached, a coppery scent hung heavy in the air. Archie pointed to the door, his hand trembling. Dark stains trailed across the weathered wood. With growing trepidation, we stepped inside. Chaos greeted us. Furniture lay smashed and overturned, claw marks gouged into the walls. Splatters of a dark, viscous substance painted a gruesome picture of violence, and there, amid the debris, a grisly sight stopped us cold. A human skeleton, bits of ragged flesh still clinging to the bones, splayed across the floor. It appeared to have been gnawed upon by some savage creature. Archie, his face pale, recounted a local legend in a hushed whisper. Rumors of a beast, an unnatural predator that roamed these woods. A creature never captured on film or confirmed by hunter sightings. Could this macabre scene be its handiwork? Driven by a dangerous curiosity, we resolved to uncover the truth. But first, we needed an expert. Maynard Buford, a seasoned tracker, lived on the outskirts of town. With his skills, perhaps we could piece together this dark puzzle. We made a pact, Archie and I. We would leave behind our safe, ordinary lives to pursue this mystery, no matter the cost. But as we stepped back into the sunlight, a shiver raced down my spine. The forest that had once seemed a sanctuary now felt alien, threatening. What secrets did it hold in its shadowy depths? And were we truly prepared to face them? Daylight was fading by the time we reached Maynard's rustic homestead. We found him on his porch, whittling a piece of wood, his weathered face creased in concentration. He listened intently as we recounted our grim discovery, his eyes narrowing at the mention of the rumored beast. "I've heard stories," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Whispers passed down through generations. A creature that defies description, stalking the deepest parts of the forest." He leaned forward, fixing us with a piercing stare. "If it's real, if this is its work, you boys best be careful. This is no ordinary animal." With Maynard's warning ringing in our ears, we made our preparations. We gathered supplies, camping gear, weapons, traps, anything that might aid our hunt. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we ventured back into the woods under a canopy of stars. Our first night was a symphony of unsettling noises. The hooting of an owl, the skittering of unseen creatures in the underbrush. Each sound set my nerves on edge. We huddled around our meager campfire, jumped at every snapping twig. When dawn broke, we began our search in earnest, scouring the forest for signs of the creature's passage. It wasn't long before we found them. Broken branches, tufts of coarse hair snagged on bark, and then more disturbing, deep gouges in tree trunks, far larger than any bear's claws could make. Scattered remnants of tattered clothing, scraps of faded photographs, eerie totems marking the beast's territory. As we trekked deeper into the wilderness, we heard stories from locals that chilled our blood. Tales of bone-chilling howls echoing through the night, of livestock vanishing without a trace. Gradually, a pattern emerged. The attack seemed to center around the abandoned cabin, as though the beast was drawn to that macabre site. Yet for all the signs of its presence, the creature itself remained elusive, always a step ahead of us. Frustration mounting, we redoubled our efforts. We set traps, rigged cameras, took shifts standing guard through the long nights. But the beast seemed to mock our efforts, leaving grisly remains for us to find each morning. On the fifth night, exhaustion overtook us. We let our guard down just for a moment. That was all it took. A crash in the underbrush jolted me awake, heart pounding. I turned to rouse the others and froze. A pair of luminous eyes stared back at me from the darkness, eerily intelligent. Then, quick as a shadow, they were gone. Sleep eluded us after that. We waited, weapons clutched tight, barely daring to breathe. Finally, as the eastern sky began to lighten, we emerged from our uneasy shelter, only to find a scene of unimaginable horror. A body lay in a clearing, a man, his limbs splayed at unnatural angles. Claw marks crisscrossed his chest and throat, so deep the white of bone showed through their tattered edges. His face, what was left of it, frozen in a rictus of terror. We recognized him as Derek Foster, a local man who had gone missing weeks earlier. Finding him like this, savaged and discarded like a broken doll, sent icy tendrils of fear down my spine. The creature had struck close to home. Grimly, Maynard examined the corpse for clues. Embedded in one of the gaping wounds, he found a tuft of coarse, dark fur, matted with congealed blood. The creature had left a piece of itself behind. Archie carefully collected the gruesome evidence, his hands trembling. A grim silence settled over our camp as the weight of our discovery sank in. This was no mere animal we hunted. No natural predator could inflict such calculated brutality. "We're not dealing with something of this world," Maynard said softly, his eyes haunted. "The old stories, they speak of a being not quite human, not quite beast, a creature of nightmare that feeds on terror as much as flesh." Hearing our unflappable guide give voice to the dark suspicion growing in my own mind sent a chill through me. What chance did we stand against something that defied the very laws of nature? Yet even as doubts gnawed at my resolve, a cold fury rose to eclipse my fear. This thing, this twisted abomination, had shed innocent blood. It had to be stopped, whatever the cost. We broke camp with a new sense of urgency, no longer merely hunting, but stalking our quarry in turn. Every rustle of leaves, every flicker of shadow took on an ominous edge. My senses strained for a glimpse of luminous eyes, a flash of dark fur. That night, we didn't dare light a fire, huddling close in the choking darkness. My mind raced, conjuring monstrous visions of what lurked beyond our feeble circle of torchlight. At some point, I must have drifted into an uneasy doze, for I woke with a start to a sound that turned my blood to ice. A scream, high and wavering, abruptly cut short. Then a silence more terrible than any sound. Beside me, Archie and Maynard were already on their feet, weapons drawn. "That came from the direction of the old cabin," Maynard said grimly. We charged through the underbrush, heedless of the branches that tore at our skin. The cabin loomed before us, a black silhouette against the star-flecked sky. At first glance, all seemed still, but as my eyes adjusted, I glimpsed a darker shape huddled at the tree line. No, not huddled, crouched, feeding. A wave of nausea rose in my throat as I realized what I was seeing. The creature, its muzzle buried in the belly of some fresh kill. Time seemed to slow as it raised its head, luminous eyes locking onto mine. In that instant, I knew two things with terrifying certainty. We had found the beast, and it had been waiting for us. The creature rose slowly, blood dripping from its maw. It was larger than I'd imagined, muscles rippling beneath its matted fur. As it stepped into a shaft of moonlight, I saw its face clearly for the first time. A twisted amalgamation of human and animal features, its eyes glittering with a feral intelligence. Beside me, I heard the click of a gun being cocked. Archie, his hands trembling, leveled his rifle at the beast. It regarded him almost casually, as though the weapon were nothing more than a child's toy. Then, with a speed that defied logic, it charged. Archie's shot went wide, the bullet burying itself in a tree trunk. The creature was on him before he could fire again, a blur of teeth and claws. His scream cut through me like a knife. I raised my own gun but hesitated, fear and revulsion warring with the need to act. In that moment of indecision, Maynard leaped forward, an inhuman roar tearing from his throat. He barreled into the creature, knocking it away from Archie's prone form. The two titans clashed in a whirlwind of snarls and flashing fangs. Despite Maynard's prodigious strength, it quickly became clear he was outmatched. The beast moved with a fluid grace, seeming to anticipate his every attack. I watched in horror as razor-sharp claws raked across Maynard's chest, sending him staggering back. Blood bloomed on his shirt, black in the moonlight. The creature crouched, preparing to spring, to deliver the killing blow. Desperation overrode my paralysis. I charged forward, firing wildly, hoping to distract the beast, to buy Maynard a precious few seconds. To my shock, one of my shots found its mark, striking the creature's shoulder. It reeled back, a high, keening cry piercing the night. For a heartbeat, our eyes met, and in that moment, I saw something that chilled me more than its savagery. Intelligence, cruel and calculating, and something else, something disturbingly akin to amusement, as though this were all some twisted game. Then it was gone, melting into the shadows, as though it had never been. Shaking, I rushed to Maynard's side. His wounds were deep, but thankfully not fatal. Archie was less fortunate. The beast's claws had laid open his throat, his lifeblood staining the earth. Numb with shock and grief, we carried his body back to the cabin. We had set out to uncover a mystery, to stop a creature of nightmare. Instead, we had paid a blood price, and the beast was still out there, waiting. As we tended our wounds, a heavy silence fell. The weight of our folly, of the horrors we'd witnessed, pressed down like a physical thing. Finally, Maynard spoke, his voice rough with pain and exhaustion. "We're in over our heads, Jasper. This thing, it's beyond us. We need to get out of here, get help." I wanted to argue, to insist that we couldn't abandon our hunt, but one look at Archie's lifeless face, at the shadows haunting Maynard's eyes, and I knew he was right. This was a battle we couldn't win, not alone. With heavy hearts, we made our preparations to leave, to seek aid and regroup. But even as we packed our gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was out there, watching, waiting for us to make a mistake. And deep down, I knew that this was far from over. Dawn was breaking as we emerged from the woods, the first golden rays of sun doing little to chase away the shadows clinging to our souls. Each step was an effort, our bodies battered, our minds reeling from the horrors we'd witnessed. We made our way to the nearest ranger station, a small, unassuming building that suddenly felt like a bastion of normalcy in a world gone mad. The ranger on duty, a grizzled man named John, listened to our tale with growing disbelief and concern. "You're lucky to be alive," he said grimly, shaking his head. "I've heard stories about that cabin, about strange happenings in those woods, but nothing like this." He radioed for backup, his voice tight with urgency. Within hours, the station was swarming with activity. Police, wildlife officials, even a team of specialists flown in from the city. They pored over our evidence, the grisly photos and Maynard's wounded testimony painting a picture almost too strange to believe. And yet, for all the resources brought to bear, the creature seemed to have vanished like smoke. Search parties combed the woods but found no trace of the beast. It was as though the forest itself had swallowed it whole. As the days stretched into weeks, the official investigation began to lose steam. Theories were put forth: an uncommonly large bear perhaps, or a pack of wolves driven to boldness by hunger. The evidence of the creature's unnatural nature was quietly swept aside, explained away. But Maynard and I knew the truth. We had seen the intelligence in those glowing eyes, felt the weight of its malevolent presence, and we knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that it was still out there. In the end, the cabin was torn down, the site cordoned off and declared off limits. Archie's death was ruled an animal attack, his body laid to rest with a hero's honors. Life, as it always does, moved on. But for Maynard and I, there could be no going back. We were changed, haunted by the knowledge of what lurked in the shadows of the world. The creature had marked us, in ways both seen and unseen. I returned to my own cabin but found no peace there. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind through the trees, set my heart racing. I knew deep in my marrow that I would never feel truly safe again. Maynard and I still meet sometimes, sharing a drink and memories of the friend we lost. We don't talk much about that night, about the scars we both bear. But it's there in the silence between us, a bond forged in blood and terror. And sometimes, in the deepest watches of the night, I'll wake in a cold sweat, the echo of a howl ringing in my ears. In those moments, I'll remember luminous eyes watching from the darkness, and I'll wonder if the creature is still out there, stalking the shadows of the forest. Wonder if our paths will cross again, in some final fateful confrontation. In the end, there are no easy answers, no tidy resolutions. Only the knowledge that the world is vaster and stranger than we ever dared imagine, and that sometimes the monsters of our nightmares are all too real. That is the legacy of our hunt, the burden Maynard and I will carry for the rest of our days. A secret we can never share, a truth too terrible to face. But in each other, we have found a measure of solace, an understanding that needs no words. For in the end, perhaps that is all we can ask for. Not a happy ending, but the strength to endure, to keep living in a world forever changed by the touch of the unknown. And the knowledge that, whatever horrors may lurk in the shadows, we do not face them alone. I was 15 when I went camping with my dad in the Bankhead National Forest in Alabama during the particularly bitter winter of 2022. What had started as a father-son bonding trip quickly devolved into something I still struggle to comprehend. We'd arrived later than planned at our campsite, the afternoon sun already beginning its hasty retreat behind the dense tree line. Dad was always methodical about setting up camp, tent positioned to block the wind, sleeping bags laid out with precision, food secured in bear-proof containers, even though black bears in this region typically hibernate during winter. I admired his thoroughness, though at the time I'd rolled my eyes at what I deemed excessive caution. "Better to be over-prepared than under-prepared, Theo," he'd say, noticing my impatience. By nightfall, our modest fire had dwindled to glowing embers that cast faint dancing shadows across our small clearing. The woods around us had fallen into an unsettling silence, the usual ambient sounds of nature muffled by the frost that blanketed everything. Even the wind seemed to have stopped, leaving an unnatural stillness that made the hair on my arm stand despite the layers I wore. Dad checked his watch. "It's getting late. We should turn in if we want to get an early start on that ridge trail tomorrow." I nodded, zipping up my jacket tighter as we began our pre-sleep routine. The temperature had dropped significantly after sundown, the cold air burning my lungs with each breath. We were about to crawl into our sleeping bags when we heard it. A low, drawn-out rasping sound cut through the stillness of the forest. It was distant, but distinct, something between a groan and a wheeze, carrying through the trees with unnerving clarity. Dad and I froze, locking eyes across our dying campfire. His expression shifted from confusion to concern in an instant. "Must be the wind," he offered, though his voice had tightened noticeably, betraying his own uncertainty. We remained motionless, straining to listen. For several long seconds, nothing but silence surrounded us. I had almost convinced myself it had been my imagination when the sound came again. Louder this time, more deliberate. An elongated, agonized groan that seemed to seep through the trees like frigid water. Then a third time, the sound so eerie that I felt my body temperature drop. This wasn't an animal call I recognized, nor was it the creaking of trees or the howling of wind. This was distinctly human. "Dad," I whispered, my voice barely audible even to my own ears. "What was that?" He was already reaching for the heavy-duty flashlight we'd packed. "I don't know, but someone might be hurt." His jaw was set in determination, but I could see apprehension in his eyes. "Grab that walking stick, Theo. Stay close." I snatched the sturdy oak branch we'd used for hiking earlier that day, gripping it so tightly my knuckles whitened. Whatever courage I possessed came not from bravery, but from fear of being left alone at the campsite. We moved cautiously away from our clearing, the beam of Dad's flashlight cutting through the darkness like a blade. The frozen ground crunched beneath our boots, each step sounding impossibly loud in the quiet forest. The bitter cold stung my cheeks and numbed my nose, while my breath formed thick clouds that momentarily obscured my vision. The groaning came again, closer now, guiding us through the trees. My heart hammered against my ribs as we crested a small hill, and the flashlight beam fell upon a figure on the ground about 30 yards ahead. It was a woman. She lay sprawled on the incline, head pointing downhill, her body largely motionless, save for slight movements accompanying those terrible sounds emanating from her throat. The whole forest seemed to hold its breath as we approached her, an unnatural hush falling over everything. A profound sense of wrongness settled in my gut, the kind of instinctual warning that predates rational thought. Dad knelt beside her, angling the flashlight to illuminate her face without blinding her. I hung back slightly, clutching my makeshift weapon, uncertain of what we'd stumbled upon. Her eyes were unfocused, glassy pools that reflected the flashlight beam without truly seeing it. Her dark hair was matted with frost, and her clothes, inadequate for the freezing temperatures, were wet from prolonged contact with the snow. When she attempted to speak, her words came out slurred and nearly unintelligible. "Help, please," she managed, her lips blue from the cold. "We're here to help," Dad assured her, already shrugging off his outer jacket to place over her. "What's your name?" What happened? Through fragmented sentences and confused mumbling, we pieced together her story. Her name was Heather. She'd been camping with her boyfriend, Thomas, at a site about a mile from ours. They'd gotten into a heated argument after both had been drinking heavily. In his anger, Thomas had stormed off with their car keys, leaving her alone in the woods with no transportation. In her intoxicated state, she'd spotted the faint glow of our campfire in the distance and decided to bring us some of their remaining firewood as a peace offering or exchange for help. But disoriented by alcohol and darkness, she had slipped on the icy terrain and fallen, too weak and impaired to get back up. The groaning we'd heard had been her desperate attempts to call for help, her condition preventing her from producing anything more coherent. Dad carefully helped her to a sitting position, though it was immediately clear she wouldn't be walking far on her own. She was hypothermic, dangerously intoxicated, and showing early signs of frostbite on her fingers. "We need to get you warmed up," Dad said, his voice calm but urgent. "Can you tell us how to get back to your campsite?" Heather gestured vaguely eastward, mumbling something about a big rock and blue tent. With considerable effort, we managed to get her upright between us, practically carrying her as we followed her slurred directions. It took nearly 40 minutes to locate her campsite, where a hastily erected blue tent stood beside a stone fire ring containing nothing but cold ashes. The site was in disarray, camping equipment scattered haphazardly, empty bottles strewn about. The signs of their argument were evident. We got her inside the tent and into her sleeping bag, adding Dad's emergency thermal blanket for extra warmth. I collected wood while Dad revived her fire, both of us working quickly to combat her hypothermia. "Thomas will come back," she slurred as the fire began to crackle. "He always comes back." Dad and I exchanged glances. Leaving her alone seemed dangerous, but we had limited options. The nearest ranger station was hours away, and neither of us had cell service. After ensuring she was as comfortable and warm as possible, Dad made the difficult decision. "Heather, we'll check on you first thing in the morning," he promised. "Try to stay warm and don't leave the tent. Your boyfriend will probably return soon." She nodded weakly, already drifting toward an alcohol-induced sleep that worried me more than comforted me. As we made our way back to our own campsite, guided by moonlight and our flashlight, Dad's expression was troubled. "Not much else we can do tonight," he said, though it sounded like he was trying to convince himself more than me. "She should be okay until morning, if she stays put." But I couldn't shake the image of her lying alone in the darkness, producing those terrible sounds, slowly freezing to death. If we hadn't heard her, if we'd dismissed those groans as just another strange forest noise. Back at our tent, neither of us slept well that night. The forest had lost its peaceful quality, instead feeling watchful and threatening. Every crack of a branch or whisper of wind had me bolt upright, imagining Heather wandering deliriously through the trees, or something worse lurking in the darkness beyond our tent. Dawn arrived with reluctant gray light filtering through the frost-covered nylon of our tent. I had managed only fractured sleep, plagued by dreams of disembodied groans and frozen bodies. Dad looked equally exhausted, the lines around his eyes more pronounced as he checked his watch. 6:15, he mumbled, rubbing his face. "Let's check on Heather before we do anything else." We prepared quickly, skipping our usual morning coffee ritual in favor of a faster departure. The forest looked different in daylight, less menacing but somehow more deceptive, as though its picturesque winter beauty concealed darker truths. The trek to Heather's campsite felt shorter in the morning light. As we approached, I noticed something immediately wrong. The campfire we'd built for her had completely died out, not even embers remaining. More concerning was the absolute silence emanating from the blue tent. "Heather?" Dad called out, approaching cautiously. When no response came, he unzipped the tent flap and peered inside. I knew something was wrong from the way his shoulders tensed. She's gone, he said, voice tight with concern. The sleeping bag lay empty, Dad's thermal blanket discarded on the ground. Heather had vanished, but all her belongings remained, including a small backpack containing her wallet and identification. Her boyfriend Thomas hadn't returned either. There was no sign of a vehicle anywhere near the campsite. Maybe she went looking for him, I suggested, though the word sounded hollow even to me. Dad surveyed the surrounding area with increasing agitation. In her condition, she could barely stand last night. He was right. The idea of Heather navigating the frozen forest alone, still intoxicated and hypothermic, seemed impossible. Yet the alternative explanations that floated through my mind were even more disturbing. We spent the next hour searching the immediate vicinity, calling Heather's name until our voices grew hoarse. The forest swallowed our shouts, returning nothing but mocking echoes. Eventually, Dad made the decision to hike to the ranger station, a 6-mile journey along hazardous winter trails. We need to report this properly, he said, gathering essential supplies into his day pack. Someone with actual search and rescue training needs to get involved. I nodded, relieved that authorities would soon take over this increasingly troubling situation. Yet, as we secured both our campsite and Heather's before departing, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched from somewhere within the dense tree line. Several times I whirled around, certain I'd caught movement in my peripheral vision, only to find nothing but stillness. The hike to the ranger station was grueling. Ice had formed over parts of the trail, making each step treacherous. The temperature had risen slightly, causing periodic showers of melting ice to rain down from the tree branches above, startling me each time with cold droplets down my neck. When we finally reached the small wooden outpost that served as the ranger station, I felt a surge of relief that quickly dissipated. The station appeared unmanned, a note on the door indicating that rangers were conducting trail maintenance on the southern section of the forest and would return by afternoon. Dad cursed under his breath, something I rarely heard him do. We'll have to wait, he decided, checking his phone again for service. Still nothing. We settled onto the wooden bench outside the station, sharing a protein bar from Dad's pack. The forest around the station seemed different somehow, more maintained, less wild, yet somehow more sinister in its carefully managed appearance. Something doesn't feel right about all this, I said finally, breaking the uncomfortable silence. Dad nodded slowly. I know. I've been thinking the same thing. Do you think Thomas came back and something happened between them? I asked, voicing one of the darker scenarios that had been forming in my mind. I don't know, Theo. But people don't just vanish into thin air, especially not people who were as incapacitated as she was. A sudden thought struck me. Her ID was still there, in her backpack. Should we have brought it with us? Dad sighed. Probably, but I didn't want to disturb a potential scene any more than necessary. He avoided using the word crime, but I knew what he meant. We waited nearly 3 hours before a Forest Service truck pulled up to the station. 2 rangers emerged, looking surprised to find us there. Dad quickly explained our situation, describing Heather, her condition, and her mysterious disappearance. The rangers exchanged a look I couldn't interpret. Blue tent, near Hollow Creek? The older ranger asked, his weathered face betraying nothing. Dad nodded. That's right, about 5 miles northeast of here. The younger ranger was already on his radio, requesting backup. Something about his urgency made my stomach knot with dread. You folks aren't the first to report strange occurrences in that area, the older ranger said carefully, choosing his words with obvious deliberation. There have been several incidents over the past few years. Incidents? Dad echoed, his voice sharper than intended. The ranger nodded grimly. Missing hikers, abandoned campsites. Most were eventually explained. People getting lost, wildlife encounters. Campers simply deciding to leave without properly checking out. But a few cases remain open. A sickening realization washed over me. You think what happened to Heather is connected to these other cases? I didn't say that, the ranger responded quickly, too quickly. But we're going to investigate thoroughly. I need you both to show us exactly where you encountered this woman and where her campsite is located. The next few hours passed in a blur. More rangers arrived, equipment was gathered, and we found ourselves leading a small procession back through the forest toward Heather's campsite. The rangers maintained radio contact with their base, their voices professional but tense. When we arrived at the blue tent, everything was exactly as we'd left it, abandoned and still, with no sign of either Heather or Thomas. The rangers immediately began a systematic search, photographing the site and bagging certain items as evidence. One ranger discovered something that made him call his colleagues over immediately. Marks in the frozen earth near the back of the tent that looked like drag marks, partially obscured by a fresh dusting of snow but still discernible. These are recent, he said, snapping photographs, within the last 12 hours. Dad and I watched from a distance as they followed the trail of disturbed snow and soil. It led about 50 yards into the forest before abruptly stopping at the base of a large oak tree. The rangers spent considerable time examining this area, their expressions growing increasingly troubled. What did they find? I whispered to Dad. I don't know, he replied, his voice strained. But I think we should prepare ourselves. This might be worse than we thought. One of the rangers approached us, notepad in hand. I need to ask you both some more specific questions about last night, he said. His tone was professional but had taken on a gravity that hadn't been there before. Of course, Dad agreed. You said the woman, Heather, mentioned an argument with her boyfriend. Did she provide any details about the nature of this argument? Dad shook his head. She was very disoriented, just mentioned they'd been drinking and fighting. And you're certain she said he drove away? She specifically mentioned a car? Yes, I interjected, remembering clearly. She said he took the car keys. The ranger made a note, looking troubled. We haven't found any vehicle tracks on any of the access roads that would indicate a car recently entered or exited this part of the forest. A cold sensation crept up my spine that had nothing to do with the winter air. What are you saying? I'm not saying anything definitive yet, the ranger replied carefully. But either the boyfriend didn't leave by car, or Heather wasn't telling us the truth, Dad finished for him. The ranger nodded grimly. We need to consider all possibilities at this point. As the afternoon wore on, more disturbing details emerged. The rangers' search expanded, and they discovered items belonging to Heather scattered in a pattern that suggested she had been moving, or been moved, deeper into the forest. A sock here, a watch there, creating a trail that seemed deliberately placed. Like breadcrumbs, I overheard one ranger say to another, his voice hushed but carrying in the still forest air. By evening, the situation had escalated considerably. More personnel arrived, including state police officers. Dad and I were asked to provide formal statements. Our casual camping trip now officially part of an investigation. We're going to need you both to leave the forest tonight, the lead officer informed us. This is now an active investigation area. Dad nodded, looking simultaneously relieved and concerned. Of course, but is there any way you can keep us updated on what you find? The officer hesitated. I can take your contact information, but I should be clear. This may be connected to other cases we're investigating. Information might be limited. As we packed up our campsite under the watchful eyes of a ranger assigned to escort us out, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being told only a fraction of what the authorities suspected. The rangers' carefully neutral expressions couldn't completely mask their concern, and I noticed how they constantly scanned the tree line, hands never straying far from their sidearms. Our escort ranger was taciturn during most of our hike back to the parking area, but as we approached my dad's truck, he finally spoke candidly. Look, I probably shouldn't say this, but there have been 6 disappearances in this section of Bankhead over the last 3 years. Not all reported properly, not all connected officially. But locals know. There's something not right about this part of the forest. Dad secured our gear in the truck bed. What do you mean, not right? The ranger glanced around, ensuring we were alone. People vanish, but their belongings stay behind. Arranged sometimes. Like someone's playing a game. He cleared his throat. The official line is isolated incidents, exposure, animal attacks, hikers getting lost. But some of us have our doubts. I felt sick. You think someone's out there, taking people? I didn't say that, the ranger backtracked quickly, echoing his colleague from earlier. Just be careful where you choose to camp in the future. Some places aren't as safe as they look. As we drove away from Bankhead National Forest that evening, I watched the trees recede in the side mirror, their dense silhouettes merging into an impenetrable wall of darkness. I couldn't help but wonder if someone, or something, was watching us leave, already planning their next move in whatever macabre game was being played in those hollow woods. The drive home to Huntsville was tense and largely silent. Dad gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity, his usual road trip chatter conspicuously absent. I stared out the passenger window at the darkening landscape, my mind replaying the events of the past 24 hours on an endless loop. Should we have done more? I finally asked, breaking the uncomfortable silence. For Heather, I mean. Dad sighed deeply, his exhale fogging slightly in the truck's cabin despite the heater running full blast. I've been asking myself the same question, Theo. But what else could we have done? We found her, got her warm, took her back to her campsite. We checked on her first thing in the morning. We could have stayed with her, I suggested, though even as I said it, I recognized the impracticality. In her boyfriend's tent? 2 strangers watching over her while she slept? Dad shook his head. That wouldn't have been appropriate, and you know it. We made the best decision we could with the information we had. He was right, of course, but rationality did little to assuage the guilt that had taken root in my chest. The image of Heather's disoriented, frost-tinged face kept surfacing in my thoughts, followed inevitably by imaginings of what might have happened after we left her. Images made more disturbing by their lack of clarity. When we finally pulled into our driveway around 9 that evening, Mom was waiting anxiously on the porch. Dad must have called her from the road when I dozed off briefly. "Thank God you're both okay," she said, embracing each of us tightly. "Come inside and tell me everything." We recounted the story over hastily prepared sandwiches at the kitchen table, Mom's expression growing increasingly concerned as we described the ranger's reactions and the hints of previous disappearances. "They're not letting campers into that section of the forest anymore," Dad explained, "at least temporarily. The ranger who escorted us out said they'd be conducting a thorough search operation over the next few days. And they think this is connected to other missing persons cases?" Mom asked, her clinical psychologist's mind already analyzing patterns. "They wouldn't say officially," Dad replied, "but reading between the lines, yes, I think they do." That night, sleep eluded me despite my exhaustion. My bedroom, usually a haven of comfort, felt exposed and vulnerable. Every creak of the house settling sent my heart rate spiking, and the shadows in the corners seemed deeper, more concealing than usual. When I finally did drift off near dawn, my dreams were filled with groaning voices and blue tents empty of their occupants. The next morning, a Sunday, brought a knock at our door. 2 state police officers stood on our porch, their expressions professionally neutral. "Mr. Bennett, we'd like to ask you and your son a few follow-up questions about the incident in Bankhead Forest," the female officer stated once Dad had invited them in. We sat in our living room, the formality of the interview making our home feel suddenly unfamiliar. They asked for specific details, exact times, precise locations, verbatim recollections of Heather's statements. They showed us photographs of several individuals, asking if any resembled Heather or matched her description. "This one," I said, pointing to a woman with dark hair and a slight build. Her face was thinner, I think, but the eyes looked similar. The officers exchanged glances. That's Madeline Winters, the male officer explained. She was reported missing from a camping trip in Bankhead 14 months ago. Never found. A chill settled over the room. Dad leaned forward. Are you saying we didn't encounter someone named Heather at all? That it was this missing woman? We're not saying that definitively, the female officer clarified, but physical descriptions match, and the location is consistent with where Miss Winters was last seen. But that's impossible, I protested. Heather, or whoever she was, told us about her boyfriend Thomas, about their fight that same night. If this woman went missing over a year ago. People in extreme distress, especially suffering from hypothermia and intoxication, can become confused about time and events, the male officer explained gently. Or, he didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. Or she was deliberately misleading you. The officers continued, showing us more photographs, some of missing persons, others of evidence collected from various sites within the forest. One photo made my stomach lurch. A blue tent, nearly identical to the one we'd found Heather in, photographed at what was clearly a different location. This tent was found abandoned in October 2021, about 3 miles from where you encountered the woman you called Heather, the female officer explained. The occupant, a solo hiker named Gregory Whitman, was never located. What are you suggesting? Dad asked, his voice strained. The male officer closed his folder. At this point, we're exploring all possibilities. One theory is that someone is using abandoned equipment from previous victims to establish temporary sites. You mean like a trap? I blurted out, the horror of the implication hitting me full force. We didn't say that, the female officer replied quickly, echoing the forest ranger's careful, non-committal responses. But we are concerned about certain patterns emerging in these cases. They left us with their cards and a request to call immediately if we remembered any additional details, no matter how insignificant they might seem. After they departed, Dad and I sat in stunned silence, the weight of their implied theories pressing down on us. They think someone is hunting people in that forest, I finally said, giving voice to the conclusion neither officer had been willing to state explicitly. Dad didn't contradict me. They're investigating that possibility, yes. And we walked right into the middle of it, I continued, a tremor entering my voice. If we hadn't heard her groaning, if we hadn't gone to investigate... Don't, Dad cut me off firmly. Don't go down that road, Theo. We did hear her, we did investigate, and we're safe. Focus on that. But safety felt like an illusion now, a thin veneer easily shattered. The familiar world had acquired an overlay of potential threat that I couldn't unsee. In the days that followed, I compulsively checked news outlets for information about the investigation. Local coverage was surprisingly minimal. Brief mentions of an ongoing search operation in Bankhead National Forest, with authorities requesting that the public avoid certain trails. Nothing about missing campers, nothing about Heather or Thomas or any pattern of disappearances. The lack of information felt deliberate, as though authorities were containing knowledge of whatever was happening in those woods. A week after our return, Dad received a phone call from Detective Rivera, one of the officers who had interviewed us. He took the call in his study, emerging 20 minutes later with a troubled expression. They found something, didn't they? I asked immediately. Dad nodded slowly. They found a car hidden about half a mile from where Heather's campsite was, covered with branches and forest debris. It's registered to a Thomas Keller from Nashville. My heart raced. So there really was a Thomas. He didn't leave her after all. No, he didn't, Dad confirmed grimly. His body was in the trunk. The blunt statement hit me like a physical blow. I sank onto the couch, trying to process this horrific development. They think he'd been dead for at least 48 hours before we even encountered Heather, Dad continued, his voice clinical in the way it got when he was trying to distance himself emotionally from disturbing information. which means he was already dead when she told us he'd driven away after their fight. She lied to us, I whispered, remembering Heather's glazed eyes, her slurred speech. Had her disorientation been an act? Or had she been as much a victim as Thomas, forced to play some role in a game I couldn't begin to comprehend? The detective couldn't share many details, Dad said, sitting heavily beside me. But they're treating this as a homicide investigation now, not just a missing persons case. Did they find Heather? I asked, already guessing the answer. No trace of her. Dad rubbed his face wearily. They're considering the possibility that she was abducted, or that she might have been involved in Thomas's death. I remembered the ranger's words. People vanish, but their belongings stay behind, arranged sometimes, like someone's playing a game. What about the other missing people? I asked. The ones the rangers hinted about? Dad shook his head. Detective Rivera wouldn't confirm any connection officially, just said the investigation is expanding in scope. That night, I dreamed of Heather again, but this time she wasn't lying helpless in the snow. Instead, she stood perfectly straight at the edge of our campsite, watching silently as Dad and I slept. In the dream, I awoke to find her leaning over me, her previously unfocused eyes now sharp and aware, her blue-tinged lips curled in a slight smile. You should have stayed at your campsite, Dream Heather whispered. Some things in these woods aren't meant to be found. I woke, gasping, sheets twisted around me like restraints, the memory of her voice still ringing in my ears despite having only existed in my dream. 2 days later, the local news finally broke a more substantial story. Multiple disappearances in Bankhead National Forest under investigation. The article was light on specifics, but confirmed that authorities were investigating several related incidents over a 3-year period. A brief statement from the FBI indicated they were now assisting local law enforcement, suggesting the case had escalated significantly. Compelled by a need I couldn't articulate, I began researching previous disappearances in Bankhead Forest, starting with Madeline Winters, the woman whose photograph had resembled Heather. What I found disturbed me deeply. Over the past 5 years, at least 9 people had gone missing while hiking or camping in the northeastern section of the forest. Some cases had been attributed to misadventure, exposure to elements, accidents, wildlife encounters, but several remained unsolved. I created a timeline mapping the disappearances against locations in the forest. A pattern emerged. They formed a rough circle with a radius of about 3 miles, centered on an area marked on forestry maps as Hollow Creek Junction, the same area where we had found Heather. When I showed my research to Dad, his face paled. "Theo, I think you need to step back from this," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "The authorities are handling the investigation." "But don't you see?" I insisted, pointing to my map. "There's a clear pattern here, and we were right in the middle of it. We might have information that could help them understand what's happening." Dad studied my work with obvious reluctance. "I'll call Detective Rivera again," he finally conceded. "See if this is something they're already aware of." The detective arrived at our house that evening, accepting my compiled research with professional courtesy that didn't quite mask her concern. She spent nearly an hour reviewing my findings, occasionally asking clarifying questions or making notes. "You've got good analytical skills," she finally said, closing her notebook. "And yes, we've identified a similar geographical pattern." "So there is someone operating in that specific area," I pressed, feeling vindicated despite the horror of the situation. Detective Rivera chose her words carefully. "We're pursuing multiple theories. One involves a human perpetrator or perpetrators using the remote terrain to their advantage." "And the other theories?" Dad asked. "Some evidence suggests the involvement of a group rather than an individual," she replied, sidestepping the question. "Beyond that, I can't comment on ongoing investigative avenues." After she left, taking copies of my research with her, Dad turned to me with an expression I'd rarely seen. a mixture of pride and deep concern. "I understand your need to make sense of what we experienced," he said, "but I'm worried about your involvement in this, Theo. This isn't a mystery novel. It's a real investigation into dangerous events." "I know that," I replied defensively. "That's why I'm trying to help." "And you have helped," Dad assured me. "But now it's time to let the professionals handle it. Promise me you'll step back from this." I promised, intending to honor my word. But that night, an email arrived from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line read simply, "You were there. You saw." My finger hovered over the delete button. This was exactly the kind of involvement Dad had warned against. But curiosity overwhelmed caution, and I opened the message. It contained only a single sentence. "Not all who wander the hollow woods are lost. Some are hunting." Below this cryptic statement was an image, a photograph of a blue tent, identical to the one we'd found Heather in. But what made my blood freeze was the background. Behind the tent, barely visible in the tree line, stood a figure watching the campsite. The image was grainy, taken from a distance, but I could make out enough to recognize the dark hair and slim build of a woman who could have been Heather. She wasn't alone in the woods, after all. And whatever game was being played in Bankhead Forest, I was now unmistakably part of it. I stared at the email for what felt like hours, my mind racing through possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. Who had sent this? How did they know I'd been in Bankhead Forest? How did they get my email address? The timestamp on the email showed it had been sent at 3:17 a.m., which only added to its unsettling nature. I checked the image properties, hoping for metadata that might reveal something about its origin, but all identifying information had been stripped. Whoever had sent this knew enough to cover their digital tracks. After wrestling with my conscience, I finally decided I couldn't keep this to myself. Despite my promise to Dad about stepping back from the investigation, this email had come to me directly. It felt targeted, personal. I printed the email and image before knocking on my parents' bedroom door, despite the late hour. "Theo?" Mom answered, looking concerned at my obvious distress. "What's wrong?" Dad appeared behind her, instantly alert. "What happened?" I wordlessly handed them the printout. Dad's expression darkened as he examined the image while Mom gasped softly. "When did you get this?" Dad demanded, suddenly looking like the structural engineer he was, analyzing a potentially catastrophic failure. "About an hour ago," I admitted. "I don't know who sent it or how they found me." Dad was already reaching for his phone. "I'm calling Detective Rivera. This crosses a line." Within 45 minutes, 2 police officers were at our house, bagging my laptop as evidence and taking statements. They were followed shortly by Detective Rivera herself, who interviewed me extensively about the email. "Have you received any other unusual communications? Friend requests from strangers? Messages on social media?" she asked, her pen poised over her notebook. I shook my head. "Nothing. I've been pretty quiet online since we got back from camping." "The email address uses Proton Mail," she noted, "an encrypted service that's difficult to trace. This suggests someone with technical knowledge who's deliberately trying to stay anonymous." "But why contact me at all?" I asked, the question that had been plaguing me since I'd opened the message. "What's the point?" Detective Rivera studied me for a moment before answering. "Sometimes perpetrators seek connection with investigations into their activities. It provides a sense of control, of playing both sides of the game." She hesitated before adding, "Or they may see you as someone who understands what they're doing." The implication made me feel physically ill. "I don't understand anything about what's happening in those woods." "Which is precisely why this contact is concerning," she replied. "Your family needs to be extra vigilant now. No unusual routines, no isolated activities. We'll have patrols increase their presence in your neighborhood." After she left, my parents instituted immediate security measures, checking locks obsessively, installing a new alarm system, and implementing a strict "no one goes anywhere alone" policy. Dad even took time off work to drive me to and from school, something I hadn't needed since freshman year. The days that followed were tense, filled with jumpy reactions to normal sounds and suspicious glances at unfamiliar cars that passed our house. My laptop was eventually returned, scrubbed and examined by cyber forensics, but I couldn't look at it without remembering that cryptic message. Not all who wander the hollow woods are lost, some are hunting. What did it mean? Were there multiple people involved in whatever was happening in Bankhead Forest? The ambiguity of hunting troubled me most. Hunting for what, or whom? 2 weeks after receiving the email, when no further contact had come, life began to settle into an uneasy new normal. Detective Rivera called periodically with brief, uninformative updates that amounted to little more than "the investigation continues." The lack of progress or concrete information was maddening. Then came the package. It arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, a small padded envelope addressed to me by name with no return address. Mom, who had become hypervigilant about anything unusual, called Dad immediately. "Don't open it," he instructed when he got home, examining the package with suspicious eyes. "I'm calling Detective Rivera." The detective arrived within the hour, bringing along an officer with expertise in suspicious packages. After determining it contained no explosives or harmful materials, she carefully opened it wearing gloves. Inside was a single USB drive and a handwritten note that read, "What the authorities won't tell you." Detective Rivera's expression remained neutral, but I detected a flicker of concern. "We'll need to examine this before you can access it," she said, bagging both items as evidence. "What if it contains information about Heather?" I asked, unable to hide my frustration. "Or about what's happening in those woods?" "Then we'll handle it appropriately," she replied firmly. "But this could just as easily be an attempt to plant malware on your devices or to further intimidate your family." She was right, of course, but rationality did little to quell my burning curiosity. What information could be on that drive that the authorities were supposedly concealing? 3 days later, Detective Rivera returned to our house looking troubled. She sat with my parents and me at our kitchen table, her usual professional demeanor slightly frayed. "The USB drive contained photographs," she began carefully, "images from Bankhead Forest taken over the past 4 years. They appear to show surveillance of campsites and hikers." My stomach tightened. "Like someone was stalking them?" She nodded grimly. "The images progress chronologically, showing various individuals in the forest. Some are people who later disappeared." "Was Heather in them?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Detective Rivera confirmed. "Both Heather Wilson and Thomas Keller appear in photos dated 3 days before you encountered her." "So they were being watched before whatever happened to Thomas," Dad said, his engineer's mind connecting the sequential dots. "It appears so," she agreed. "But what's more concerning is that the most recent photographs on the drive—" She trailed off, meeting my parents' eyes with a grave expression. "The most recent photographs are of your family, specifically of you and Theo at your campsite the night you found Heather." Mom gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Dad's face hardened into stone. "Someone was watching us that night?" I asked, my voice cracking with the horrifying realization. "While we slept?" Detective Rivera nodded solemnly. "It appears that whoever is behind these incidents observed your interaction with Heather and has now taken an interest in your family, particularly in Theo." "Why me?" I demanded, fear mingling with confused anger. "What did I do?" "It may not be anything you did," she explained gently. "Sometimes perpetrators of serial crimes develop fixations on witnesses or those who intersect with their activities. They may see you as someone who glimpsed their work and lived to tell about it." "This has gone too far," Dad declared, his voice tight with controlled fury. "We need to consider relocating temporarily." "That might be advisable," Detective Rivera agreed. At minimum, I would recommend staying with relatives outside the area until we make more progress in the investigation. And what about school? I protested, though the objection felt hollow even to me, overshadowed by the knowledge that someone had been watching us, photographing us without our knowledge. Your safety comes first, Mom said firmly, her psychologist's composure momentarily cracking. We'll work with your teachers on remote learning options. That evening, as I packed for our hastily arranged stay with my aunt in Birmingham, I noticed a folded piece of paper that had been slipped under my bedroom window. My heart racing, I unfolded it with trembling fingers. Written in the same handwriting as the note with the USB drive was a single sentence. They won't tell you about the others who came before. I should have immediately shown this to my parents or called Detective Rivera. Instead, driven by an impulse I still can't fully explain, I quickly photographed the note with my phone and then brought it downstairs to show my parents. The distinction feels trivial now. I did report it after all. But that small act of securing my own copy marked a turning point in my involvement. Within hours, we were on the road to Birmingham, our home locked and under police surveillance. My Aunt Cindy welcomed us with worried embraces and countless questions that my parents answered vaguely, mentioning only a security concern related to a case Dad had encountered while camping. That night, in the unfamiliar guest bedroom of my aunt's suburban home, I found myself unable to sleep. The knowledge that someone had been observing us in the forest, that they knew who I was and where I lived, left me feeling perpetually exposed. Around 3 a.m., I gave up on sleep and opened my laptop, connected to my aunt's Wi-Fi. Acting on an impulse that felt both reckless and necessary, I created a new anonymous email account, and I sent a message to the same anonymous inbox. Who are you, and what do you want from me? I didn't truly expect a response, certainly not an immediate one. But to my shock, a reply arrived within minutes. Not who, but what. The question isn't who I am, but what happened to Heather and the others. The authorities know more than they're telling you. Search for information on Operation Deadfall if you want the truth. My finger hovered over the reply button, but caution finally asserted itself. I took screenshots of the exchange, then deleted the email account I'd created. Whatever game this person was playing, I wouldn't make myself an easier target. The next morning, bleary-eyed from lack of sleep, I discreetly researched Operation Deadfall while my parents discussed logistics with Aunt Cindy. Most results were references to military operations or hunting techniques, nothing related to Bankhead Forest or missing persons. But on the fourth page of search results, I found a brief mention in a regional news archive from 2019. The article focused on budget allocations for the Alabama Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, but included this single sentence. Additional funding was approved for ongoing surveillance operations, including Operation Deadfall, targeting illegal activities in protected wilderness areas. It wasn't much, but it confirmed the operation was real, some kind of surveillance program in Alabama's wilderness areas. Could it be connected to whatever was happening in Bankhead Forest? I debated whether to share this discovery with my parents or Detective Rivera. On one hand, it seemed like potentially valuable information. On the other, it would reveal that I'd contacted the anonymous emailer against explicit instructions to avoid engagement. My decision was made for me when my phone rang later that day, Detective Rivera calling with an update. We've identified a person of interest in the case, she informed me, her voice cautiously optimistic. A former Forest Service employee named Victor Harlan. He worked as a trail maintenance supervisor in Bankhead until 2020 when he was dismissed following complaints about erratic behavior. Do you think he's responsible for what happened to Heather and Thomas? I asked. We're not jumping to conclusions, she replied, ever careful with her words. But his knowledge of the forest and its remote areas makes him someone we want to speak with. Unfortunately, We haven't been able to locate him yet." I hesitated, then decided to take the risk. "Detective, have you ever heard of something called Operation Deadfall?" The silence that followed was brief, but telling. When she spoke again, her voice had taken on a new edge. "Where did you hear that term, Theo?" I explained about the anonymous email and my subsequent research, bracing for a reprimand. Instead, her response surprised me. Operation Deadfall was a joint surveillance initiative between state authorities and the federal government, she explained after a long pause. It began in 2018 following reports of organized criminal activity in remote wilderness areas, including parts of Bankhead Forest. "Criminal activity? Like what?" I pressed. "Initially drug production and trafficking," she replied. "Remote forests provide good cover for methamphetamine labs. But during the surveillance, they observed other concerning patterns of behavior unrelated to drug activity." "Like people disappearing," I suggested. "I can't comment on specific findings," she said, reverting to her more guarded manner. "But yes, the operation documented unusual occurrences that later became part of our current investigation." "And Victor Harlan? Was he part of Operation Deadfall?" Another telling pause. "He was interviewed during the operation," she finally acknowledged, "as were all Forest Service employees with access to the areas under surveillance." This felt like the first real information I'd received since our ordeal began. Confirmation that there was indeed something systematic happening in those woods, something that authorities had been aware of for years. "Why keep this secret?" I asked, unable to contain my frustration. "If people knew there was danger in those woods—" "Panic helps no one," Detective Rivera cut in firmly, "and premature disclosure of investigative methods can compromise ongoing operations. That's all I can say on this matter, Theo. Please, no more unauthorized communications with whoever is sending these messages. They're attempting to manipulate you for reasons we don't yet understand." After we hung up, I sat on the edge of my aunt's guest bed, processing this new information. Operation Deadfall, Victor Harlan, a surveillance program that had documented unusual occurrences in Bankhead Forest years before our encounter with Heather. The pieces were there, but I couldn't yet see how they fit together. What connected a former Forest Service employee to the disappearances? Why would someone be trying to feed me information about a covert surveillance operation? And most importantly, what had really happened to Heather after we left her at that blue tent? That night, I dreamed I was back in Bankhead Forest, but the trees had eyes. Small cameras affixed to their trunks, blinking red lights tracking my movement through the wilderness. In the dream, I followed a trail of blue fabric scraps deeper into the woods, finally arriving at a clearing where dozens of blue tents stood in concentric circles. In the center stood Heather, but when she turned to face me, her features had been replaced by a blank expanse of skin, featureless except for a single red blinking light where her right eye should have been. I awoke drenched in sweat, the image lingering behind my eyelids. Something about the dream tugged at my memory, not the surreal horror of Heather's featureless face, but something more concrete. Cameras in the trees. Operation Deadfall had been a surveillance program. What if physical evidence of that surveillance still existed in the forest? What if the person contacting me wanted me to find that evidence? The realization felt important, but I had no way to act on it while sequestered in Birmingham. All I could do was compile what I knew and wait for an opportunity to share it with Detective Rivera in person, rather than over potentially monitored phone lines. That opportunity came sooner than expected. 3 days into our stay with Aunt Cindy, Detective Rivera called with news that changed everything. "We've located Victor Harlan," she informed us. "He was found deceased in a remote cabin about 30 miles from Bankhead Forest. Initial evidence suggests suicide, but we're investigating thoroughly." "Did he leave any explanation?" Dad asked, his face grim. "Any confession?" "No note," Detective Rivera replied. "But we found equipment in his possession that connects him to the surveillance photographs you received. And there's something else." She paused, seeming to weigh her next words carefully. We found a journal. It contains entries about specific individuals who went missing in Bankhead, including detailed observations of Heather Wilson and Thomas Keller before their incident. So he was stalking them, I said, the pieces finally falling into place. He was responsible for the disappearances. The evidence strongly suggests his involvement, she confirmed. We're still processing the scene, but at this point, we believe the immediate threat to your family has been neutralized. Relief washed over my parents' faces, but I felt strangely unsettled. It seemed too neat, too convenient. The suspect conveniently dead by his own hand, unable to explain his motives or methods. What about Heather? I asked. Have you found any sign of her? Not yet, Detective Rivera admitted. But Harlan's journal contains several references to remote locations in the forest. We're organizing search teams to investigate each one systematically. And the person who's been contacting me? I pressed. Was that Harlan too? We're still investigating the source of those communications, she replied, her voice suggesting she considered this a minor loose end. It's possible Harlan had an accomplice, or someone with knowledge of his activities, is attempting to insert themselves into the investigation. When the call ended, my parents were visibly relieved. The nightmare, it seemed, was nearly over. We could return home soon, resume our normal lives, try to put the horror of Bankhead Forest behind us. But that night, as my family celebrated the apparent resolution with takeout pizza and ice cream, I received one last message from the anonymous mail. Harlan was part of it, but not all of it. The cameras saw everything. The blue tents are markers. This isn't over. Attached was a map image, a section of Bankhead Forest with a location marked by a single red X. I stared at my phone screen, torn between deleting the message and reporting it immediately, or pursuing this final lead that might reveal the complete truth about what had happened in those hollow woods. The choice I made that night would change everything. I deleted the email, not immediately. First, I took screenshots, saved the map image, and forwarded everything to Detective Rivera with a brief explanation. Then I deleted the message and blocked the sender. Whatever game this anonymous correspondent was playing, I was finished being their pawn. Detective Rivera called within minutes of receiving my email. "You did the right thing, Theo," she assured me, her voice tense despite the praise. "We'll investigate this location immediately. Please don't share this with anyone else for now." "Do you think it's legitimate?" I asked. "Or just someone trying to manipulate the investigation?" "Hard to say," she admitted. "But we can't ignore potential evidence, especially if it might lead to finding Heather Wilson or any of the other missing persons." 2 days later, we returned home to Huntsville under police escort. The investigation wasn't officially closed, but with Harlan deceased and no further threatening communications, authorities deemed it safe for us to resume our normal lives with reasonable precautions. I returned to school, where rumors about my brief absence had already spawned wild theories ranging from witness protection to family tragedy. For almost a week, everything seemed to be returning to normal. Detective Rivera called once to inform us that they had investigated the location from the map, but found nothing significant there. She attributed the tip to someone attempting to waste police resources or insert themselves into a high-profile case. I tried to accept this explanation, to believe that with Harlan's death, the threat had truly ended. But the final message from the anonymous emailer continued to trouble me. The cameras saw everything. The blue tents are markers. This isn't over. What if there was something at that location that the police had missed? What if the answers were still out there, waiting to be discovered? The thought became an obsession, growing stronger each day until I finally confided in my best friend Wesley. I showed him the screenshots I'd saved, explained the entire bizarre sequence of events, from finding Heather in the woods to the mysterious communications I'd received. "This is seriously messed up," Wesley said when I'd finished, his eyes wide. "Like horror movie level messed up." "I know," I agreed. "And I can't shake the feeling that there's more to the story than what they're telling us. Harlan's death was too convenient, too neat. Wesley studied the map image on my phone. So this is where your mystery informant thinks there's evidence? I nodded. According to them, yes. And the cops checked it out but found nothing? That's what they said. Wesley was quiet for a moment, then looked up with the gleam of adventure in his eyes that I should have recognized as dangerous. What if we checked it out ourselves? Are you insane? I demanded, though the suggestion had already planted itself in my mind. After everything that's happened? Hear me out, Wesley insisted. Whatever was happening in those woods, the cops say it's over. Harlan's dead. We'd just be hiking to a specific spot in a national forest, which is completely legal. If we find nothing, no harm done. If we find something the cops missed, we'd be interfering in an active investigation, I pointed out. Or providing valuable evidence, he countered. Look, I'm not saying we should go alone. My cousin Jake works as a park ranger in Oak Mountain. He could come with us. He's trained, he carries a sidearm. We'd be completely safe. I should have shut down the idea immediately. I should have remembered my promise to my parents to stay away from anything related to the Bankhead case. Instead, I found myself considering the logistics. How would we even get there? My parents are watching me like hawks. Wesley grinned. Tell them you're coming to my house for a study session and overnight. My parents are out of town this weekend visiting my grandma. Jake can pick us up Saturday morning. We make a day trip to Bankhead, and we're back by Sunday afternoon. No one ever has to know. It was reckless, potentially dangerous, and exactly what part of me had been wanting to do since receiving that final message. The prospect of finally getting answers, of seeing for myself what the police might have missed, was too tempting to resist. Okay, I heard myself say. Let's do it. The plan came together with surprising ease. My parents, eager for signs of me returning to normal teenage life, readily agreed to the supposed study session at Wesley's house. Jake, Wesley's 24-year-old cousin, required more convincing but eventually agreed after hearing a sanitized version of our story that emphasized our archaeological interest in some unusual structures in the forest. That Saturday morning found us in Jake's Jeep, driving the winding roads toward Bankhead National Forest. Jake was tall and fit, with the sun-weathered complexion of someone who spent his days outdoors. His ranger uniform and the holstered pistol at his hip provided a reassuring sense of authority and protection. So, you're sure this location is accessible by trail? Jake asked as we neared the forest boundary. I'm not taking you kids bushwhacking through unmarked terrain. There's a trail most of the way, I assured him, studying the map I'd created by overlaying the anonymous tip onto proper topographical maps of the area. We might have to go off trail for the last quarter mile or so, but the terrain isn't difficult. Jake nodded, seemingly satisfied. And you're absolutely sure this is legal educational research? Because if there's anything else going on here, now's the time to tell me. Wesley and I exchanged glances. Completely legal, Wesley confirmed, technically not lying. We're just interested in seeing this location for ourselves. As we entered the forest, a familiar uneasiness settled over me. The trees seemed to close in around us, watching, waiting. I reminded myself that it was just my imagination, fueled by the trauma of our previous experience. Victor Harlan was dead. Whatever had happened here was over. We parked at a small trailhead and began our hike. The day was clear and cold, typical for February in northern Alabama. Our breath formed clouds in the air as Jake led the way, setting a brisk pace along the marked trail. So what exactly are we expecting to find at this mystery location? Jake asked as we walked. I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Possibly evidence of some kind of surveillance equipment. There was a research project called Operation Deadfall a few years back, studying wildlife patterns in this area. The partial truth seemed to satisfy Jake, who launched into an explanation of various wildlife research methods used in national forests. Meanwhile, Wesley shot me a questioning look, clearly wondering why I hadn't told Jake the full story. 2 hours into our hike, we reached the point where we needed to leave the marked trail. Jake consulted my map, frowning slightly. "This is getting into pretty remote territory," he observed. "Not many people come out this way." "That's kind of the point," I replied, trying to sound casual. "The researchers would have wanted minimal human interference." Jake seemed to accept this explanation, and we proceeded carefully through the increasingly dense forest. The ground became more uneven, with unexpected dips and rises hidden beneath years of accumulated leaf litter. The silence grew deeper, broken only by our footsteps and the occasional call of a distant bird. According to my calculations, we were less than half a mile from the marked location when Jake suddenly stopped, holding up a hand for us to do the same. "Do you see that?" he asked quietly, pointing toward a dense thicket about 50 yards ahead. At first I saw nothing unusual, just winter-bare trees and dormant underbrush. Then my eyes caught a flash of color, something distinctly unnatural among the browns and grays of the forest. Blue fabric. My heart rate increased instantly. "I see it," I confirmed, my voice barely above a whisper. Jake drew his sidearm, suddenly all business. "Stay behind me," he ordered. "Both of you, right now." The transformation in his demeanor was immediate and alarming. Whatever he had spotted, it was enough to put him on high alert. We crept forward slowly, Jake leading with his weapon pointed downward but ready. As we approached, the blue fabric became more distinct, a small piece fluttering from a branch, as if deliberately placed. It appeared to be torn from something larger, perhaps a tent or tarp. Jake stopped again, his eyes scanning the surrounding area with professional intensity. "Something's not right here," he murmured. "This feels staged." The word sent a chill through me. Staged, like someone was playing a game. Beyond the blue fabric marker, the terrain sloped downward into a shallow ravine. At the bottom, partially concealed by fallen logs and winter foliage, was something that made my blood run cold. A small surveillance camera mounted on a tree trunk, its lens pointed directly at the approach we had just taken. "Is that part of the wildlife research?" Wesley asked nervously. Jake shook his head slowly. "That's not standard Forest Service equipment." He approached the camera cautiously, examining it without touching. "This is a high-end motion-activated security camera, weatherproofed, probably satellite uplinked." "Can you tell if it's still active?" I asked, fighting to keep my voice steady. Jake studied it for a moment. "The indicator light is off, which usually means it's not recording. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's not operational." He turned to face us, his expression grave. "Okay, I need one of you to explain what's really going on here. Now." I exchanged a glance with Wesley, who nodded encouragingly. Taking a deep breath, I gave Jake the complete story, from finding Heather in the woods to the mysterious communications I'd received, including the references to Operation Deadfall and the surveillance cameras. As I spoke, Jake's expression shifted from skepticism to concern to something approaching alarm. When I finished, he holstered his weapon but maintained a vigilant stance. "So you're telling me this location was sent to you by an anonymous source who might be connected to multiple disappearances in this forest, and you decided to come check it out without telling the police?" "The police did check it out," I defended weakly. "They said they found nothing." Jake gestured toward the camera. "Well, they either missed this or it wasn't here when they looked. Either way, we're leaving, now. And I'm reporting this as soon as we get back to civilization." He turned to lead us back the way we'd come, but Wesley pointed further down the ravine. "Wait, there's something else down there." About 30 yards further, half hidden by a fallen tree, was something unmistakably man-made. A small concrete structure, no larger than a garden shed, with no windows and a metal door secured with a padlock. "That's definitely not Forest Service construction," Jake muttered. "This whole area is supposed to be protected wilderness." "Could it be part of Operation Deadfall?" I suggested. "Some kind of field station for the surveillance program?" Jake hesitated, clearly torn between investigating further and getting us safely away from what was obviously an unauthorized and potentially dangerous situation. "We're just going to take a quick look," he decided finally. "Don't touch anything. Stay behind me. If I say run, you run. Understood?" We nodded solemnly, and Jake led us carefully down the ravine toward the concrete structure. As we approached, I noticed other cameras positioned strategically on surrounding trees, creating a surveillance perimeter around the small building. The concrete structure looked weathered, but not abandoned. The padlock showed no signs of rust, and the area immediately around the door was clear of debris, suggesting recent access. "This is way beyond weird," Jake commented, examining the lock without touching it. "This is some kind of unauthorized installation in federal land. Definitely illegal." "Can we see inside?" Wesley asked. Jake shook his head. "Not without breaking in, which would be a federal offense. We've seen enough. I'm documenting this with photos, and then we're leaving." He took out his phone and began photographing the structure and cameras from various angles. I walked slowly around the perimeter of the small building, noting its solid construction and the absence of any markings or identifiers. As I rounded the back corner, something caught my eye: a small ventilation grate near the ground, partially obscured by overgrown vegetation. Kneeling down, I peered through the grate into darkness. At first, I could see nothing, but as my eyes adjusted, vague shapes became visible inside: shelving units, electronic equipment, and what appeared to be stacks of files or folders. "Guys," I called softly, "there's a vent here. I can see inside." Jake quickly joined me, crouching to look through the grate. "Some kind of monitoring station," he confirmed. "Sophisticated setup, too." "But for what?" Wesley asked. "Why would anyone need this kind of surveillance out here in the middle of nowhere?" Before Jake could answer, a sound broke the forest silence: the distant but unmistakable sound of a vehicle engine. Jake straightened instantly. "Someone's coming. We need to go, now." We hurried back up the ravine, Jake leading us on a different route than we'd taken down, giving the cameras a wide berth. The engine sound grew louder, suggesting a vehicle on one of the remote Forest Service roads that crisscrossed the area. "Stay low and quiet," Jake instructed as we crested the ravine. "We're going to circle back to the main trail without being seen." For 15 tense minutes, we moved stealthily through the forest, Jake navigating with the expertise of an experienced outdoorsman. The engine sounds eventually faded, but Jake maintained our cautious pace until we rejoined the marked trail we'd originally followed. "We're hiking straight back to the Jeep," he announced, his tone allowing no argument. "No stops, no detours." The return journey passed in tense silence, each of us processing what we'd discovered. My mind raced with questions. Who had built that concrete structure? What were they monitoring? Was it connected to Operation Deadfall, to Victor Harlan, to the disappearances? And most disturbing of all, if the police had truly searched that location as Detective Rivera claimed, how had they missed such obvious evidence? When we finally reached Jake's Jeep, he immediately tried to call his supervisor at Oak Mountain, but found no cell service. He drove us out of the forest at a speed that bordered on reckless, clearly eager to put distance between us and what we'd discovered. "Listen to me carefully," he said once we were on the main highway heading back toward Huntsville. "What we found back there isn't normal. It isn't legal. And it isn't something you two should have been anywhere near." "Are you going to tell my parents?" I asked, dreading the inevitable fallout. Jake sighed heavily. "I have to report what we found. That means full disclosure of who was with me and why we were there. So yes, your parents are going to find out." "But we found something important," Wesley argued. "Something the police supposedly looked for but didn't find. Doesn't that count for anything?" "It counts for putting yourselves in potential danger," Jake retorted. "Whatever's happening in those woods is clearly not something for teenagers to be investigating." When we reached cell service range, Jake pulled over and made 2 calls. first to his supervisor, reporting what we'd found in carefully measured terms, then to the state police, asking specifically to speak with Detective Rivera. I could hear only Jake's side of the conversation, but it was enough to understand that Detective Rivera was not pleased to learn of our expedition to Bankhead Forest. The call ended with Jake agreeing to bring us directly to the police station in Huntsville. "She wants to debrief you personally," he explained as we continued driving, "and she's contacting your parents." My stomach sank. Whatever consequences awaited me would be severe. But in that moment, I was more concerned with the implications of what we'd found. If the police had searched that location as claimed but found nothing, either they were incredibly incompetent or they had deliberately concealed what was there. By the time we reached the Huntsville police station, both my parents and Wesley's mother were already waiting, their expressions a mix of fury and profound relief. The reunion was brief and tense, with promises of lengthy discussions to come once the official police business was concluded. Detective Rivera looked exhausted when she finally entered the conference room where we'd been waiting. The past weeks had clearly taken a toll on her. New lines had formed around her eyes, and her customarily impeccable appearance showed signs of neglect. "I should begin by saying how incredibly irresponsible and dangerous your actions were today," she stated flatly, addressing Wesley and me directly. "You potentially compromised an ongoing federal investigation and put yourselves at significant risk." "Federal investigation," I repeated, latching onto this new information. "So Operation Deadfall is still active?" Detective Rivera's eyes narrowed. "What I'm about to share is not for public disclosure," she said, looking pointedly at each person in the room. "But given the circumstances, limited transparency may be necessary." She took a seat at the table, folding her hands in front of her. Operation Deadfall began as a joint task force between state authorities and the FBI, monitoring illegal activities in remote wilderness areas. Its original focus was drug trafficking, but over time, evidence emerged of something potentially more disturbing. "The disappearances," I supplied. She nodded reluctantly. Patterns began to emerge: specific locations, similar victim profiles, distinctive methodology. Analysis suggested we might be dealing with a sophisticated predator using the remote terrain to his advantage. "Victor Harlan," Dad interjected. "Harlan was a person of interest," Detective Rivera confirmed. "As a former Forest Service employee, he had intimate knowledge of the terrain and access to remote areas. The surveillance equipment your son discovered today was initially installed to monitor his activities." "But if Harlan is dead, why is the equipment still active?" I asked. "And why did you tell us you found nothing at that location when we clearly saw a concrete structure and multiple cameras today?" Detective Rivera's expression tightened. "The investigation has evolved. While evidence strongly suggests Harlan's involvement in the disappearances, certain inconsistencies have emerged that indicate he may not have acted alone." "You think he had a partner?" I realized aloud. "Someone who's still out there." "That is one theory being explored," she acknowledged cautiously. "The surveillance equipment remains in place as part of ongoing efforts to identify any potential accomplices." "And you didn't tell us this because," Dad demanded, his protective instincts clearly aroused. "Because public knowledge of ongoing surveillance operations could compromise their effectiveness," Detective Rivera replied firmly. "And because until today, we had no evidence that Theo was still being targeted or manipulated by whoever sent those messages." "But I forwarded you the final email with the map," I protested. "I did everything right." "Yes, you did," she agreed. "And we investigated that location thoroughly. The concrete structure you found today was not there when our team searched the area 3 weeks ago." The implication hit me like a physical blow. "You're saying someone built that structure after you searched the area? Someone who knew I'd received the tip and might act on it eventually?" Detective Rivera's grim expression was answer enough. "Which is precisely why your unauthorized expedition today was not just foolish, but potentially played right into someone's hands. "But who?" Wesley asked, speaking up for the first time since we'd arrived at the station. "Who would go to all this trouble?" "That remains unclear," Detective Rivera admitted. "But today's events have provided valuable new information. The photographs Jake took of the installation will be analyzed immediately, and a tactical team is already en route to secure the location." Mom, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. "What does this mean for our family's safety? For Theo's safety?" "We'll be implementing additional security measures effective immediately," Detective Rivera assured her. "And I would strongly advise against any further independent investigations." This last comment was directed pointedly at me. By the time we left the police station, night had fallen. Dad drove home in tense silence, Mom occasionally glancing back at me in the rear seat with an expression that mixed worry with lingering anger. I knew extensive conversations about trust and responsibility awaited me, but my mind was too preoccupied with the implications of what we'd discovered to dread them properly. Someone had built that concrete structure after the police search, knowing I might eventually visit the location. Someone was still out there, still playing whatever twisted game had claimed Heather, Thomas, and who knew how many others. And despite Detective Rivera's assurances, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still somehow central to their plans. That night, as my parents finally finished their lengthy lecture about trust, safety, and the consequences of my actions, I sat at my bedroom window staring out at the darkness. The familiar suburban landscape of our neighborhood seemed suddenly alien and threatening, as though the hollow woods had followed me home. My phone chimed with a text message from an unknown number. "You saw, now you understand. It was never just Harlan. Look deeper." I showed the message to my parents immediately, honoring my renewed promise of complete transparency. Within an hour, Detective Rivera was at our house, confiscating my phone and setting up additional surveillance around our property. "We'll trace this," she promised. "Whoever is reaching out to you has made a tactical error." But deep down, I suspected this was no error. Whoever was sending these messages was always one step ahead, always watching, always waiting. The game continued, and somehow against my will, I remained a player. The following weeks brought increased security, but few answers. My phone was returned, wiped, and with a new number known only to immediate family. Police patrols past our house increased, and I was driven to and from school by officers in unmarked cars. The tactical team had found the concrete structure exactly as we described it, but completely empty. All equipment, files, and evidence removed, leaving nothing but bare walls. Victor Harlan's death was officially ruled a suicide, despite the lingering questions about potential accomplices. Heather Wilson remained missing, her fate unknown. The investigation continued, but momentum seemed to be fading as weeks passed without new developments. I tried to return to normal life, focusing on school and deliberately avoiding anything related to Bankhead Forest or the disappearances. But the experience had changed me fundamentally. I noticed security cameras everywhere now, wondered about hidden watchers behind every screen, questioned the official narrative of every news story. 6 weeks after our discovery in the forest, as public interest in the case was waning, I received a letter at school, handwritten on plain paper, slipped into my locker somehow despite the enhanced security measures. "Some mysteries solve themselves if you wait long enough. February 16th, 2021. Patient intake 47291, Huntsville Psychiatric Hospital." I almost discarded it immediately, but something stopped me. A date, February 16th, 2021, almost exactly 1 year before our camping trip, and a specific reference to the psychiatric hospital where my mother occasionally consulted as a visiting psychologist. Instead of taking it to the authorities immediately, I took it to my mother that evening, showing her the note while my father was still at work. Her reaction told me everything. The color drained from her face as she read the cryptic message. "Mom," I prompted when she remained silent, "what does this mean?" She looked up, her professional composure cracking. "Patient 47291, she whispered. It was Heather. The revelation shattered everything we thought we knew. Heather Wilson had been a patient at Huntsville Psychiatric Hospital a year before we encountered her in the forest. My mother had never treated her directly but recognized the case from staff discussions. A young woman with severe dissociative episodes and paranoid delusions about being watched, monitored, experimented on. She had been committed after being found wandering in Bankhead Forest, claiming to have escaped from observers who were using the woods as a human laboratory. Hospital staff had dismissed her claims as delusions, medicating her heavily until she recanted her story and was eventually released to a halfway house. And the final, most disturbing connection. Victor Harlan had been an orderly at the same hospital during Heather's stay before returning to his seasonal position with the Forest Service. The truth, when it finally emerged through Detective Rivera's renewed investigation, was more horrifying than any of us had imagined. Harlan had been using his positions at both the hospital and Forest Service to identify and target vulnerable individuals, people whose mental health history meant their disappearances would be attributed to their own instability rather than foul play. The concrete structure we discovered had been Harlan's private monitoring station, where he observed his potential victims before abducting them, using techniques he had learned while working in the psychiatric ward to manipulate and control them. Heather had indeed escaped his captivity shortly before we found her in the woods that winter night. Her disorientation hadn't been from alcohol, but from the medications Harlan had been using to control her. Thomas Keller hadn't been her boyfriend, but another victim who had attempted to help her escape, paying for his courage with his life. And the mysterious messages I had received. They came from a former patient who had escaped Harlan's game years earlier, but had been too traumatized and afraid to come forward until evidence of Harlan's death emerged. She had been trying, in her damaged way, to guide the investigation toward the truth she couldn't speak directly. 1 year after our fateful camping trip, I returned to Bankhead National Forest with my father, not to the hollow woods where we had found Heather, but to a peaceful clearing where a small memorial now stood, dedicated to the victims who had been identified in Harlan's journal. Heather Wilson's name was among them. Her body had been found 3 months after our discovery, buried near one of Harlan's remote cabins. She had died from exposure the very night we found her. Our efforts to warm her and return her to what we thought was her campsite, ultimately futile against the damage already done to her system by Harlan's drugs and the bitter winter cold. The case was officially closed now. Harlan had indeed acted alone. His suicide, prompted by fear of discovery after our encounter with Heather, revealed his activities. The elaborate surveillance system, the concrete structure that appeared after the police search, all were eventually traced to the anonymous informant, the escaped former victim who had been monitoring Harlan for years, gathering evidence while struggling with her own trauma. As Dad and I stood before the memorial, the forest around us was quiet. Not the unnatural, watchful silence that had disturbed us during our camping trip, but the peaceful quiet of a wilderness gradually healing. "Do you think we could have saved her?" I asked. The question that had haunted me for a year, finally spoken aloud. If we had done something differently that night? Dad placed a hand on my shoulder. "We did everything we could with what we knew at the time, Theo. Sometimes that has to be enough." I nodded, understanding now what I couldn't then, that sometimes horror exists not in the supernatural or the fantastical, but in the darkest corners of human nature. And sometimes bearing witness, refusing to look away from that darkness, is the most important thing we can do. As we turned to leave, I took one last look at the memorial, at Heather's name etched in stone. In the hollow woods, Where the trees had once seemed to watch with malevolent intent, there were now only echoes of what had happened, and the promise that those lost would be remembered, their stories told, their suffering not forgotten. The woods would continue to hold secrets, as all wild places do. But the darkest secret had been brought into the light, the nameless dread given shape and substance, and finally, justice. I walked back to the car with my father, leaving behind the silent trees and the memories they contained, carrying forward only the hard-won wisdom that comes from confronting true horror and emerging, changed but unbroken, on the other side. After quite the rough patch, I ended up in a rickety cabin out in the Ozarks in the winter of 2021. That's what happens when you lose your job, can't keep up with mortgage payments, and your house goes into foreclosure. It was honestly devastating. My wife had passed away 2 years earlier, and every day since felt like swimming upstream. Eventually, I just ran out of steam. After the bank took my home, I called in a favor from an old friend who owned a cabin in Arkansas near the edge of the woods. He said I could rent it for next to nothing, at least until I got back on my feet. I assumed it would be better than sleeping in my truck, so I packed up what little I had left and made the move. The drive down was suffocating in its loneliness. 6 hours of highways that gradually narrowed into state roads, then county roads, and finally a winding gravel path that seemed to disappear into the forest itself. My GPS lost signal about 3 miles before my destination, forcing me to navigate by the crude, hand-drawn map my friend had faxed to me weeks earlier. When I finally arrived, the cabin hardly looked like salvation. It was small, with weathered gray wood that had seen at least 30 winters. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the front porch listed noticeably to the right, as if it were slowly sinking into the earth. A stone chimney climbed up one side, black with decades of smoke. The inside wasn't much better. A main room with a kitchenette, a small bedroom, and a bathroom barely large enough to turn around in. The plumbing worked, thankfully, though the water ran brown for nearly a minute before clearing. The electricity was spotty at best, with lights that flickered whenever the ancient refrigerator kicked on. But it was mine, for now. And as I unpacked my meager belongings, clothes, a few books, some framed photos of better times, I tried to convince myself that this was just temporary, that somehow, at 43 years old, I could rebuild what I'd lost. That first night, I sat on the creaking porch with a cup of instant coffee, watching darkness swallow the woods. The trees stood like sentinels, their bare winter branches clawing at the darkening sky. In the distance, an owl called, the sound echoing through the valley. I shivered, though not entirely from the cold. The first week passed in a blur of small repairs and adjustments. I fixed the leaking kitchen sink, replaced a broken window pane, and cleared years of leaves from the gutters. Physical labor helped quiet my mind, kept me from dwelling too much on what I'd lost. My daily routine took shape quickly. I'd wake at dawn, make coffee on the old gas stove, then drive to the small town 30 minutes away to use the library's internet. The librarian, a gentlewoman in her 60s, took pity on me and would save the daily newspaper. "Not many folks coming through looking for work these days," she said one morning, sliding the classified section toward me. "Most young people move away, nothing much to hold them here." I nodded, not bothering to explain that I wasn't young, and that I hadn't exactly chosen this place. I was just desperate. Each afternoon I'd return to the cabin and work on whatever needed fixing. The isolation was both blessing and curse. No one to judge me for my failures, but no one to talk to either. The silence sometimes pressed in until I could feel it in my chest, heavy and insistent. Nights were the hardest. I'd lie awake listening to the countless sounds of the forest. Wind through branches, animals moving in the underbrush, the occasional distant howl that might have been a coyote, or might have been something else entirely. Sometimes I'd wake in the dark, heart pounding, certain I'd heard something just outside my window. The locals I encountered during my trips to town were friendly enough but reserved, the kind of people who'd nod a greeting but wouldn't pry. At the general store, where I bought canned goods and other necessities, the owner would sometimes share bits of local knowledge. "Supposed to snow tonight," he'd say, bagging my items. "Roads get bad quick out your way. Might want to stock up." Or, "Saw some big animal tracks down by Miller's Creek yesterday. Probably just a bear, but best keep your garbage locked up tight." I appreciated his advice, but noticed how he'd watch me carefully whenever the conversation veered toward the area where my cabin was located. There was something in his expression I couldn't quite read, not quite concern, not quite warning, but something adjacent to both. It was during my third week that things began to change. The weather had turned milder, and new growth was appearing in the forest. I'd grown more comfortable with my surroundings, less jumpy at every snapping twig or rustling leaf. Then, one night, as I dozed in the threadbare armchair by the fireplace, I was jolted awake by a sound outside. Not the usual forest noises I'd grown accustomed to, but something deliberate, a slow, heavy movement along the side of the cabin. I froze, listening intently. There it was again, a shuffling sound, followed by what I could only describe as snuffling, like something with a short snout was sampling the air near my wall. My mind immediately went to bears, which I knew were common in the Ozarks. But something about the sound wasn't right. I'd encountered black bears before on camping trips years ago. They moved differently, breathed differently. This was sharper somehow, with occasional grunts that had an almost porcine quality. I sat motionless until the sounds eventually faded. Even then, I couldn't bring myself to investigate. Something primitive in my brain warned against it. The next morning, I examined the area around the cabin. The ground was soft from recent rain, and there, clear as day, were tracks. Large ones pressed deep into the mud, indicating considerable weight. But they weren't bear tracks, at least none I'd ever seen. The shape was wrong, with toes that seemed too long, too articulated, and the pattern of movement suggested something that walked partly upright. I took photos with my phone, intending to ask someone in town about them, but something held me back. Perhaps it was the fear of appearing foolish, the city guy spooked by ordinary wildlife. Or perhaps it was something deeper, an instinctive reluctance to acknowledge what I'd found. Instead, I spent the day securing the cabin, checking locks, reinforcing the flimsy back door with a chair wedged under the handle. Basic precautions, I told myself. Nothing to do with those strange prints or the unease that had settled in my stomach like a cold stone. That night, the sounds returned. Closer this time, more purposeful. I heard scratching at the kitchen window, a slow, deliberate drag of something hard against the glass. When I finally gathered the courage to look, pressing my face against the cold pane and squinting into the darkness, I caught a glimpse of movement, a large, hunched shape disappearing into the tree line. Over the next few weeks, the visits became more frequent. I would hear movement outside almost every night, sometimes just passing by, other times lingering near windows or doors. I began keeping a journal, noting times and behaviors, trying to find patterns that might explain what was experiencing. One entry read, April 12th, 2:15 a.m. Heavy footsteps on porch. Stayed for approx 10 minutes. Sound of sniffing under door. Left when I accidentally knocked over lamp. Another. April 16th. Dusk. Spotted large form at forest edge. Too large for coyote. Wrong shape for bear. Moved in strange loping gait. Watched cabin for nearly an hour before retreating. The evidence mounted. Tufts of coarse grayish hair caught on the rough wood of the porch railing. Deep claw marks on a tree near the cabin, about 6 feet off the ground. And once, a half-eaten carcass of what might have been a raccoon, left prominently in the center of the clearing, almost like an offering, or a warning. Sleep became elusive. I would jolt awake at the slightest sound, lying rigid under my blankets, straining to interpret the noises outside. Was that just the wind, or something pressing against the wall? Was that distant cry an owl, or something else entirely? My trips to town became less frequent, partly because I'd had no luck with job hunting, partly because I'd grown increasingly reluctant to leave the cabin unattended for long periods. I couldn't shake the feeling that my absence was noted, perhaps even anticipated. The general store owner commented on my haggard appearance one afternoon as I stocked up on supplies. "You looking a bit rough there," he said, eyeing the dark circles under my eyes. "Everything all right out at that cabin?" I hesitated, then asked, "Do you know if there are any unusual animals in these woods? Anything different from what you'd normally expect?" He paused in his counting of change, his expression cautious. "Different how?" "I don't know. I've been hearing things at night, seeing tracks that don't look quite right for the wildlife I know about." He studied me for a long moment before responding. "These woods are old, older than any of us. Sometimes they hold things that don't have proper names." He pushed my change across the counter. "My advice? Don't go looking for what's looking for you." His words followed me all the way back to the cabin, settling in my mind like a splinter that couldn't be removed. By early May, whatever was visiting my cabin had grown bolder. No longer content to merely circle and investigate, it began testing boundaries. I would wake to find the screen door partially torn from its hinges, or gouges in the wooden windowsills, as if something had tried to pry them open. One morning I discovered all my carefully hung laundry had been pulled from the line and scattered across the yard. Each item had been handled, some torn slightly, others apparently smelled or tasted, small wet spots and saliva marks evident on the fabric. The incident that truly terrified me came after a particularly heavy rainfall. I'd been in town all day and returned to find muddy prints leading directly to my front door. But what froze my blood were the handprints, yes, handprints, pressed into the mud beside the steps. They were large and misshapen, with fingers too long and joints that bent at odd angles, but unmistakably hand-like. That night I barricaded myself inside, pushing the small couch against the door and keeping my baseball bat within reach. Outside, the familiar shuffling began earlier than usual, while the sun was still setting. I could hear it circling the cabin, pausing occasionally, then moving on. Around midnight, the first direct challenge came. A heavy thump against the door, forceful enough to shift the couch slightly. Then another. Not quite a ram, but a deliberate test of strength. I stood in the center of the room, bat raised, my breathing shallow and quick. "Go away," I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. The response was immediate, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the walls, followed by a higher-pitched sound that resembled nothing so much as laughter. Not human laughter, but the mocking approximation of it, as if something was attempting to mimic a sound it had heard but didn't fully understand. The testing of the door stopped, but I could hear movement around the cabin all night. Slow, patient circling, waiting. In the morning light, I examined the door. The wood had splintered slightly where the creature had struck it. I touched the damaged area, feeling sick. The door wouldn't withstand another such assault. That day I drove to the nearest hardware store and bought additional locks, a reinforcing metal plate for the door, and heavy-duty flashlights. I couldn't afford a gun, but I picked up bear spray, though I wasn't convinced it would be effective against whatever was stalking me. As I worked to secure the cabin, a terrible thought occurred to me. What if it wasn't trying to get in? What if it was trying to make sure I couldn't get out? The nightly visits continued, growing increasingly aggressive. The creature, I had stopped trying to classify it as any known animal, would scratch at windows for hours, an endless nerve-wracking sound that made sleep impossible. It would knock over anything I left outside, destroy any small repairs I made to the porch or steps. I began to feel that it was studying me, learning my routines, testing my responses. When I shouted or made noise, it would retreat temporarily, only to return more determined than before. When I stayed silent, it would grow bolder, pressing against the walls, as if searching for weakness. One particularly awful night, it discovered that it could reach the bathroom window, which was smaller but less secure than the others. I lay in bed, listening to the methodical scraping as it worked at the frame, trying to create an opening. When the glass finally shattered, I leapt up and rushed to slam the bathroom door shut, wedging a chair under the handle. I stood in the hallway, heart hammering, as I heard something large squeeze through the window, glass tinkling as it was dislodged. Heavy breathing filled the small bathroom, then a snuffling, seeking sound as it scented the air. The doorknob turned slowly, testing the barrier between us. The door shuddered as weight pressed against it, the chair legs squeaking against the floor. I backed away, gripping the bat so tightly my knuckles were white. After what seemed like hours, the pressure eased. I heard more glass breaking as the creature exited the way it had come. But it had crossed a threshold, literally and figuratively. It had breached my sanctuary, if only partially. The message was clear. Nowhere was truly safe. The next day, I boarded up the bathroom window with trembling hands. I called my friend who owned the cabin, trying to keep my voice steady as I asked if there had ever been problems with aggressive wildlife in the area. "Not that I know of," he said, "though I don't get out there much these days. Why? Something bothering you?" I couldn't bring myself to describe what was happening. It sounded too fantastical, too close to madness. "Just curious," I said. "Thought I heard something big around the cabin at night." "Probably just a bear," he replied casually. "They get pretty bold sometimes if they smell food." But it wasn't a bear. I knew that with absolute certainty, and it wasn't after food, at least not the kind you keep in a pantry. That evening, I sat at the small kitchen table writing a lengthy entry in my journal, documenting everything that had happened. If something happened to me, I wanted there to be a record, something to explain what had occurred. As darkness fell, I found myself writing, "I don't think I can stay here much longer. Whatever is out there is getting more aggressive, more determined. Each night it tries something new. Each night it gets a little closer. I don't know what it wants from me, but I can feel its hunger growing. Not just physical hunger, but something deeper, a need to possess, to consume in some way I don't fully understand." I paused, pen hovering over the page as I heard the now familiar sounds beginning outside. Tonight they started with an almost gentle scratching at the chimney, as if it were thinking, considering, planning its approach. By late May, I had reached my breaking point. Sleep deprivation and constant fear had worn me down to a shell of myself. I'd lost weight, my hands shook constantly, and I jumped at the slightest sound. The creature's visits had become a nightly certainty, each one more prolonged and intense than the last. I had decided to leave, to abandon the cabin and whatever strange territory dispute or hunting ritual I had unwittingly become part of. I'd packed my few belongings and planned to depart at first light, when I hoped the creature would be least active. My last evening in the cabin was unseasonably warm. The air felt heavy, charged with an approaching storm. I sat on the porch, nursing a cup of coffee, trying to savor one final moment of peace before my escape. The setting sun cast long shadows through the trees, and the woods smelled of wet earth and new growth. That's when my sixth sense alerted me, that primitive part of the brain that knows when you're being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I slowly turned my head toward the tree line to my left. There it was, partially obscured by a large oak, but visible enough to freeze my blood. Large and hunched, covered in patchy gray fur that revealed sickly pale skin beneath. Its face was elongated with a short pig-like snout and eyes that reflected the dying sunlight like dull coins. It stood on two legs, but seemed uncomfortable with the posture, its long arms hanging almost to the ground. Our eyes met across the clearing. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then it opened its mouth, revealing yellow teeth too numerous and too sharp to belong to any normal omnivore, and released a sound that began as a grunt and rose to a high-pitched screech. I dropped my coffee mug, which shattered on the porch boards. My paralysis broke, and I bolted toward the cabin door. But even as I moved, I knew I'd made a critical mistake. I should have remained still, should have backed slowly into the cabin. The sudden movement triggered something primal in the creature, and it surged forward with shocking speed. I sprinted off the porch, veering away from the cabin door, hoping to circle around and approach from another angle. My boots slipped in the mud as I heard crashing behind me, branches breaking, undergrowth being trampled by something heavy and fast. The creature's breathing was loud, wet, and ragged, unnervingly close. I weaved between pine trees, changing direction erratically, using the trunks as barriers. Once I nearly slammed face first into a tree, barely managing to pivot at the last second. I could feel hot breath on my neck, hear snapping jaws just inches from my back. Panic gave me speed I didn't know I possessed. When I spotted the yellow glow of the porch light through the trees, I made a desperate final push. Somehow, miraculously, I reached the porch. I hurled myself at the door, wrenching it open and tumbling inside. My shoulder collided painfully with the door frame, but adrenaline dulled the sensation. I kicked the door shut with my foot and threw the bolt, just as something heavy slammed against the other side. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. Outside, the creature howled, a deep, mournful sound that shifted into that horrible pig-like squeal. The porch boards creaked under its weight as it paced back and forth. For several minutes it scratched and pawed at the door, testing the reinforcements I'd installed. I remained frozen on the floor, afraid that even the smallest movement might provoke it further. Then, abruptly, the sound stopped. The silence was almost more terrifying than the attack had been. I strained to hear anything, breathing, movement, any indication of where it had gone. But there was nothing. I spent that night huddled in the center of the room, baseball bat in hand, jumping at every creak and settling sound the old cabin made. But the creature didn't return. Dawn found me still awake, still clutching the bat. As sunlight filtered through the curtains, I gathered my courage and peered outside. The clearing was empty, peaceful in the morning light. Birds sang in the trees as if nothing had happened. I waited until mid-morning before venturing out, moving cautiously, ready to retreat at the first sign of danger. But the woods seemed normal, almost indifferent to the terror of the previous night. Evidence remained, though. Deep prints in the mud showing the creature's pursuit, claw marks on trees where it had used them to change direction during the chase. Near the porch, I found clumps of that coarse gray fur caught on a nail, and what looked disturbingly like saliva dried on the door, thick and yellowish, with an acrid smell that made my stomach turn. I didn't linger. I threw my bags into the truck and left, gravel spitting from beneath my tires as I accelerated down the narrow road. I didn't stop until I reached the town, where I pulled into the general store parking lot and sat with my hands shaking on the steering wheel. The owner was sweeping the front step when I approached. He took one look at my face and nodded slightly, as if confirming something to himself. "You're leaving then," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I replied. "I can't stay in that cabin anymore." He leaned on his broom, studying me. "It found you, did it? The thing in the woods?" My mouth went dry. "You know about it?" He sighed heavily. "Stories go back generations around here. Most folks don't see it. Some feel it watching. A few." He gestured toward me. "A few get its full attention?" "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Don't rightly know," he admitted. Some say it's just a deformed bear or wild hog. Others claim it's something older, something that was here before people. All I know is it seems to fixate on certain folks, and once it does, it doesn't stop until they're gone. Or dead? I couldn't help asking. He looked away. There have been disappearances over the years. Hunters, hikers, people who stayed too long. I thanked him, though for what exactly I wasn't sure. As I turned to leave, he called after me. It won't follow you if that's what you're worried about. It stays in its territory, always has. His words provided small comfort as I drove away from the Ozarks, constantly checking my rearview mirror until the hills disappeared from view. That was 3 years ago. Life has been kinder since then. I found steady work in a city hundreds of miles away, moved into a small apartment in a densely populated neighborhood where the only nighttime sounds are traffic and occasional sirens. Sometimes I still wake in a cold sweat, certain I've heard snuffling outside my window or scratching at my door. The nightmares come less frequently now, but they haven't stopped entirely. In them, I'm always running through endless woods, something just behind me, its breath hot on my neck. I researched extensively after I left, looking for any scientific explanation for what I encountered. The closest match was reports of feral hogs, which can grow to enormous sizes and have been known to walk short distances on their hind legs. But this explanation feels hollow, inadequate to describe what stalked me in those woods. I never went back to collect the journal I left behind. Sometimes I wonder if someone else has found it, if they've read my increasingly desperate entries and dismissed them as the ramblings of an isolated, grieving man. Or worse, if they've recognized the truth in them because they've experienced something similar. There are things in this world we don't fully understand, creatures that exist in the margins between what we know and what we fear. I can't explain what happened to me in the Ozarks, can't neatly categorize or classify the thing that hunted me for those terrible weeks. All I know is that there are places where humans are not the apex predator, where we are little more than intruders, tolerated until we're not. And when toleration ends, all we can do is run and hope that we're faster than whatever is chasing us. In 1972, a plane carrying 45 passengers crashed in the midst of the towering, snow-covered Andes Mountains. A group of passengers miraculously survived, but now faced the most challenging task: surviving in the harsh conditions of this unforgiving place. The cold was biting and conditions were severe. There was no sign of life in this place, far from all elements of civilization. Food sources were non-existent, and the little food that was on board the plane quickly ran out. Here the survivors faced the most difficult decision of their lives, having to eat the bodies of their deceased companions in order to stay alive. The circumstances these passengers went through were harder than anything imaginable, yet they continued to fight and cling to survival. Would they eventually survive, or would this be their final journey? Our story begins in October 1972. The protagonists are a rugby team from Uruguay. Rugby is a sport somewhat similar to American football. Most of the team members were university students in their early 20s. Uruguay, for those unfamiliar, is one of the countries in South America. The team had been invited to play a match in Chile, also a South American country. The trip was supposed to be short, just 4 days. They planned to leave on Thursday and return on Monday. The team chartered an affordable plane, given that they were young and didn't have much money. It was a medium-sized aircraft that could seat about 50 people, with the number 571. After the team sent a passenger list to the pilot, he informed them there was room for 10 additional people. So some team members decided to bring family along. In the end, the total number of passengers reached 45, including the flight crew. Among the passengers was a young man named Nando Parado, one of the team members. It's important to remember this person as he will play a major role in the story. We can even consider him the main character. When Nando learned there were extra seats on the plane, he decided to bring his mother and sister along. He imagined taking them on an enjoyable trip, touring Chile and visiting markets. It was like a gift he was giving them with all his love. He had no idea that what awaited them would be worse than anything he could imagine. Their journey began on Thursday, October 12, 1972. They departed from Montevideo, Uruguay, heading to Santiago, Chile. They had to fly over Argentina and the Andes mountain range, towering mountains stretching long distances, considered the highest in South America. But due to bad weather that day, the pilot decided to land in Mendoza, Argentina, located just before the Andes. They spent that night in Argentina and resumed their journey on the morning of Friday, October 13th. In Western culture, Friday the 13th is considered an unlucky day. The pilot and team members weren't thinking about this at the time, but what would happen that day would indeed be the worst thing they could imagine. The plane they were on was a Fairchild FH-227, considered one of the worst in terms of design. Its engines were weak relative to its weight, making it prone to accidents. The passengers were unaware of this information. If they had known, they likely wouldn't have chosen to fly on it. During the flight, the plane had to cross over the Andes Mountains. This posed a significant risk, especially with the bad weather and weak engines. The pilot planned to circle around the southern end of the Andes range and cross through a low pass, avoiding flying at high altitudes. The mood on the plane was cheerful and lively. Passengers were playing games and singing, unaware of the danger ahead. In a pivotal moment, Nando traded seats with a friend, a decision that would later determine who would survive and who would perish. The plane reached the southern end of the Andes, and the pilot turned west towards the city of Curacao. But here, a fatal error occurred. The pilot reported to air traffic control in Santiago that they were over Curacao, when in fact they were still over the Andes Mountains. This mistake in determining their position would lead to disaster. The pilot thought they had passed the mountains and began descending, but visibility was poor due to clouds and storms surrounding the Andes peaks. Suddenly, the pilot and passengers found themselves face to face with a towering mountain. The pilot desperately tried to pull the plane up, but the weak engines couldn't provide enough power to climb at the required speed. The plane struck the mountain, and in an instant the tail and wings were torn off. Most of the fuselage disappeared, leaving only the front section. In that horrifying moment, several passengers were ejected with the disintegrating parts, especially those seated in the rear of the plane. The front section continued sliding down the snowy slope, with the remaining passengers inside clinging to life. The following moments were chaotic and terrifying, with seats flying loose and passengers' bodies colliding. Despite the catastrophic crash, there was an element of luck. The pilot's final attempt to pass through a curve in the mountain saved the front of the plane, and its relatively smooth slide down the snow saved many lives. In the end, out of the 45 passengers, 33 survived the initial impact, but many were seriously injured. In the first hours after the crash, the survivors tried to comprehend the tragic situation they found themselves in. They were at an altitude of about 3,600 meters above sea level, in an environment none of them were accustomed to. Snow and storms surrounded them on all sides, and the biting cold penetrated to their bones. The less injured survivors tried to help those more severely hurt. The scene was tragic. Scattered bodies, unconscious individuals, others suffering from fractures and serious injuries. Nando, who was still unconscious, was placed near the plane's exit, exposed to the severe cold. Here, something strange and amazing happened. Nando had suffered internal bleeding in his brain, and according to medical experts, his exposure to extremely low temperatures may have helped save his life. The intense cold helped limit brain swelling and reduce bleeding. This was like an unintended miracle. After 3 days, Nando began regaining consciousness. He was in a state of confusion, trying to understand what had happened. His friends, not considering his fragile health condition, bombarded him with the bad news all at once: the plane crash, his mother's death, and his sister's severe injuries. Despite the shock, Nando quickly grasped the situation. He asked about his sister and tried to comfort her when he learned of her location. He felt immense guilt for bringing her on this ill-fated journey. His sister was only 17 years old. After regaining his balance, Nando left the plane wreckage to see the surroundings. He was shocked by what he saw. Nothing but mountain peaks and endless snow in every direction. There was no sign of life. Not even animals existed in this harsh environment. The survivors hoped rescue teams would reach them soon. Indeed, 3 countries were participating in the search operations: Uruguay, Argentina, and Chile. But the problem was that the search area was vast, and weather conditions were extremely difficult. Additionally, the plane was white and had crashed on white snow, making it nearly impossible to spot from the air. The survivors heard the sounds of search planes flying overhead, and even glimpsed some from afar. But despite their attempts to attract attention, no one could see them. They held their breath and stood on edge, waiting for any news of their rescue. As days passed without being found, some began to lose hope. The idea that they had survived the initial crash seemed impossible, let alone surviving for several days in these harsh conditions. But the survivors themselves didn't lose hope and remained convinced they would be rescued. However, their situation was worsening day by day. Nando tried to stay by his sister's side and comfort her, but her injuries were too severe. On the 5th or 6th day, his sister passed away, reducing the number of survivors to 27. As more days passed, the survivors gradually lost hope, reaching the peak of despair on the 10th day. An important development occurred. The survivors had a small radio, and thanks to one person's expertise in electronics, they managed to create a makeshift antenna. This allowed them to pick up some radio stations and follow news about the search for them. But what they heard was shocking. Authorities announced that search operations had been halted and they couldn't be found. This news shattered the last glimmer of hope for the survivors. At the same time, hunger had begun to gnaw at their bodies severely. They had consumed all the food from the plane days ago. For water, they managed to solve this problem by using metal sheets from the plane to melt snow under the sun. But the food problem was more complex. They tried to eat anything edible, including leather from luggage and plastic. But these desperate attempts were not enough. And here the idea they all feared began to emerge: eating the bodies of their deceased companions. The idea was horrifying and terrifying for everyone. Most of them completely rejected the idea at first, while some reluctantly accepted it. It was clear there was no other way to survive: either starve to death or eat the dead. There was no third option. Some refused the idea for religious reasons, while others couldn't accept the idea of eating human flesh, especially that of their friends. It was impossible for a normal person living in normal conditions to imagine themselves in this situation. But these survivors were on the brink of death, and their ability to endure and way of thinking had completely changed. In the end, they made the difficult decision. Due to the freezing cold, the bodies were well preserved, not decomposing. They needed tools to cut the meat, so they used pieces of glass from the plane's windows to make makeshift knives. They would take small pieces each time, not making large meals. Sometimes they would cook the meat, but due to the scarcity of wood and combustible materials, they rarely managed to light a fire. Most of the time, they ate the meat raw. They all ate while disgusted with themselves. But when this meat entered their bodies and began to break down into proteins, fats, and carbohydrates, they felt energy returning to their bodies, even if only slightly. In these moments, their minds realized this was the only way to survive. no matter how disgusted they were by it. To cope better with this situation, they made an agreement among themselves. Anyone who died would allow the others to eat their body. They took photos of themselves with a camera found in the plane wreckage, and in some of these photos, parts of their companions' bodies can be seen. As days passed, they began to get used to this situation. It became part of their daily life in this place, their only source of food. They continued like this, clinging to any hope of survival, with no specific goal other than staying alive. But the difficulties didn't stop there. There was another danger awaiting them, one they were unaware of. The Andes Mountains, due to their towering height and the massive amounts of snow that fall on them, were prone to frequent avalanches. The tragedy was that the place where the plane wreckage had settled was like a valley surrounded by mountains on all sides, making it vulnerable to any avalanche that might come from above. Around the 15th day, the weather began to worsen, and large amounts of snow started falling on the area where they were. The survivors remained sheltered inside the plane's fuselage, and even built a wall-like structure using luggage and belongings to cover the opening of the fuselage. Heavy snowfall continued for about 3 days, and as the snow accumulated, the likelihood of avalanches increased. On the night of the 18th day, while the survivors were inside the plane's fuselage, they suddenly heard a sound like an explosion, as if it were a massive thunderclap. Immediately after, they felt a vibration in the ground, as if 1,000 horses were galloping towards them. In an instant, an avalanche hit the plane's fuselage, burying everyone under massive amounts of snow. The situation turned to chaos in a moment. Some were completely buried under the snow, to the point where they could no longer move at all. This is one of the worst ways a person can die. Being buried alive under snow in this deadly cold, unable to move or even breathe. Others were partially buried but could move a little. Those who could move began trying to dig themselves out. Some suffered serious injuries due to the force of the avalanche that violently struck them and threw them inside the plane's fuselage. Those who could move began trying to help the buried and injured and get them out. The situation was extremely difficult. The biggest problem was that even those who managed to get out from under the snow found no safe shelter around them. The world around them was all snow, and there was no place to take refuge or feel warmth. The entire plane fuselage was buried under the snow. The survivors remained trapped inside the fuselage for 3 days. They were all buried under the snow, but inside the fuselage. The fuselage was the only thing protecting them. Outside, snowstorms were raging, and they could hear the sound above their heads from under the snow. Strangely, the avalanche turned from a curse into a blessing, as it formed a barrier protecting them from the massive storms outside. They remained sheltered inside the plane's fuselage, and their only source of warmth was 1 or 2 small lighters. But the situation remained tragic. The avalanche caused the death of 8 of them, reducing the number of survivors from 27 to just 19 people. However, the death of these 8 was in itself a kind of tragic blessing. It provided the rest with an additional food source to live on, while at the same time reducing the consumption of the limited food sources they had. It's terrifying to talk about death in this way, but this was the reality they were living in. After 3 days under the snow, they finally managed to get out. The plane's fuselage was almost buried under the snow, but they slowly began removing the snow with their hands and cleaning the inside of the fuselage. The fuselage was like a home or shelter for them, the only place they could take refuge. As days continued to pass, the survivors began thinking of ways to get out of this predicament. Some might wonder why they didn't try to explore or move from their location. In fact, they did try. They were particularly looking for the plane's tail, believing it might contain supplies or things that could help them. But these attempts always ended in failure. They couldn't move far from the plane's fuselage. The main reason was the depth of the snow. When they walked on the snow, their legs would sink into it, making walking extremely difficult. Additionally, the weather conditions were highly unpredictable. Suddenly, fierce snowstorms could hit, and without proper clothes or equipment to protect them, advancing in any direction was extremely difficult and dangerous. Even their eyes were affected. They had nothing to protect their eyes from the intense glare of the snow, making visibility difficult. All their initial attempts to explore the surrounding areas were unsuccessful. They would cover short distances and then return to the fuselage. The survivors realized they needed a solution to the problem of walking on snow. And in situations like this, when survival is the primary goal, humans begin to invent tools to help them. As they say, necessity is the mother of invention. After deep thinking, they came up with the idea of using the foam from the plane seats along with belts to create something like snowshoes. These innovative shoes proved effective in walking on snow. They reached this invention after about a month from the beginning of their ordeal. During this month, many of them began to see Nando as the leader. He was the one among them with the strongest desire to survive, and he was always trying to motivate them and push them to continue. Incidentally, Nando was the oldest among them, so those younger than him began to see him as a leader, and he took on this role seriously and began to act as the group's leader. One day, after trying the snowshoes and feeling they would enable them to move longer distances, Nando and two of his companions, Roberto and Antonio, decided to start a new exploratory journey. They chose a day when the weather was relatively clear and the sun was shining, and they began to move. Their plan was to try to move away from the plane for as long as possible and return on the same day. It was like an experiment. They kept walking as they descended into the valley, and after climbing a hill, they saw the plane's tail from afar. The tail had flown to this location after the plane crash. They immediately headed towards the tail to explore it from the inside. They found some bags inside and began searching for any food they could find. But all they found was a small chocolate bar. At least it was a good change from the food they had become accustomed to. Among the things they also found was a camera. This camera is the one they used to take the photos that documented their survival journey in these mountains. They also found 20 4-volt batteries that were installed in the plane's tail. Here, an idea occurred to them. They remembered that at the beginning they had tried to use the plane's radio to communicate with any possible entity. They thought that maybe the battery in the radio was faulty, and that they might be able to use these new batteries to operate the plane's radio again. Nando and his companions covered a greater distance than they had planned, and they felt that time was running late. So they decided to return to their friends who were waiting for them at the plane's head the next morning. After returning with the battery, the survivors began trying to connect it to the plane's radio. There was a person named Roy Harley who had some experience with radio devices. He wasn't a specialist, but due to his basic knowledge of these matters, they appointed him as their radio expert. But the matter was very complicated, especially since they had no real knowledge of these things. There were hundreds of wires and connections everywhere. How could they connect these wires to the battery and make the radio work? It was almost impossible without real technical knowledge. Unfortunately, despite their great efforts and numerous attempts with the radio, they failed to make it work. This failure crushed their morale and made them feel more desperate. Nando, although he was also disappointed, tried to instill some hope in his companions. He would tell them, "As long as we are alive, we must not despair and must continue trying to find a way to survive." Nando was also the one who came up with the idea of using the camera to document their survival journey with photos. He would tell them, "Even if we don't survive, maybe after a few years or even 100 years, someone might find the plane wreckage and these photos, and they'll know that we stayed alive and tried." Almost 2 months had passed since the day of the crash. Among the 19 remaining people, several were injured. Some had been injured since the moment of the initial crash, and their pain was increasing with each passing day. Survival was becoming harder and harder for them. During this month, 3 more of them died, reducing the number of survivors from 19 to 16 people. Out of the 45 who were on the plane, only 16 remained. Most of the bodies of the dead had been eaten by the living, and only a few bodies remained. Among these remaining bodies were those of Nando's mother and sister. Nando being still alive, no one wanted to touch the bodies of his mother and sister. He decided to leave them until the last moment. Nando would always tell his close friend Roberto that they needed to get out of this place. How long would they remain standing in the same spot? All directions around them were frightening, as if they were in the middle of a vast ocean with no knowledge of its beginning or end. The plane's fuselage was like a small boat protecting them from this ocean, so the idea of leaving this boat was scary. This is what prevented them from moving from their place. They were afraid that any attempt to move away from this place would mean certain death. But after more than 2 months without any new sign of hope, the only option became to move from their place. Of course, everyone was afraid of this. It was like throwing oneself into the ocean literally, as they didn't know their exact location. The only idea they had was that they were currently on the western side of the Andes Mountains. They remembered that before the co-pilot died, he had told them they had passed the city of Curico, which is on the western side in Chile, so they believed they were in this area. But in reality, they were closer to the eastern side. They had been thinking all along that if they moved from this spot, they should head west because it was closer to civilization and cities, although in reality, the east was closer. On the western side, there was a high mountain in front of them, while in the east there was a valley. Going down to the valley would have been easier than climbing the mountain, but they thought that if they headed east, they would face higher and more difficult mountains, because they thought the east was far from them, while the west was close. This is what they believed, because they didn't know their real location. In reality, if they had headed east, they would have found a hotel about 20 kilometers from their location, and there were no high or towering mountains between them and the hotel. The only thing that could have hindered them was a river, and this river would indeed have been difficult to cross. But if they had reached the river near the hotel, they would most likely have been able to call for help from people on the other bank. Heading east was probably the best option for them. The path was still difficult and long, but if they had known all this information, this would undoubtedly have been their best choice. But because they believed they were on the western side, they were always convinced that if they moved from this spot, they should head west because this was their best option. Nando was insistent on getting out of this place at any cost, but the rest of the group were procrastinating due to their fear and hesitation. Whenever Nando tried to convince them, their response was that the time wasn't right, or the weather wasn't suitable, or that they needed to wait a little longer. It was clear that fear had taken hold of them. Nando realized he couldn't leave alone, so he kept trying to convince them, or at least convince some of them, to go with him. Most of them encouraged the idea of embarking on this journey, but they weren't ready to go with him. Each of them would say, "Yes, I agree with you. Someone needs to go out and try to bring help, but I can't, brother." They supported the idea, but no one volunteered to take the risk with him. Even his close friend Roberto was hesitant at first. This was his closest friend and the one who had gone with him when they found the plane's tail. But after Nando's insistence, Roberto finally agreed. The third person Nando convinced to go with them was Antonio. He was also the third person who had been with them when they found the plane's tail, and he was the most physically fit among them, so he was the natural choice for this journey. So, the same 3 who had gone out and found the plane's tail were now going to set out on a journey in search of new hope. This journey would be a journey of no return. Either they would reach safety or die trying. Therefore, they had to make all their preparations. And the rest of the group, despite their fear and hesitation, helped in preparing for the journey and provided all possible support. First, they allocated a larger share of food to the three, a share that could last them for several days, even though food was already scarce. Second, they needed a way to protect themselves from the cold at night, as it was impossible to survive amidst these mountains without something to protect them. Here, one member of the group, named Carlos, collected heat-insulating materials from inside the plane's fuselage and sewed them together using electrical wires to create something like a sleeping bag. The sleeping bag was large enough for the three of them and was very durable. Several of them took turns sewing it, and the sewing process itself took a few days. After preparing all the necessary items and tools, the trio, Nando, Roberto, and Antonio, bid farewell to their friends and set out on their difficult journey on December 12, 1972. The last thing Nando said to his friends who remained at the plane was that if they ran out of food and needed to use the bodies of his mother and sister, he gave them permission to do so. After that, the three headed west, and directly in front of them was a large mountain. They believed this mountain was the biggest obstacle in front of them, and they thought that once they reached its summit, they would be able to see the green valleys and cities or villages on the Chilean side. They realized that climbing this mountain alone would require at least a full day. They began climbing the mountain, and it was an extremely tiring and exhausting process. Climbing on this steep slope was very difficult, especially since they had no previous experience or practice in mountain climbing. At these altitudes, even breathing was difficult due to the lack of oxygen in the air. The more they moved and exerted effort, the more oxygen they needed. But due to the lack of oxygen, breathing became harder and harder. With every step they took, they faced the risk of slipping. They tried to hold on to themselves but couldn't. With every step they climbed, they would slide half a step. They then tried to climb the rocky parts, which required tremendous strength and high fitness. Rocks would sometimes fall on them. Perhaps the only thing that helped them was that they had lost a large amount of their weight. Each of them had lost about 30 or 40 kilograms. Finally, after all the effort they had exerted, they reached what they thought was the summit. But the peak in front of them was what is called a false summit. This is a peak that appears from below to be the mountain summit. But when you reach it, you discover it's a false summit, and that there's a higher peak in front of you, and that you have to climb more to reach it. This crushed their morale when they reached this false summit. But at least this place was suitable for spending the night. They slept huddled together and used the sleeping bag their friends had made for them. The cold was very harsh, but at least the sleeping bag enabled them to survive. The next day, the three continued their arduous climbing journey. Their friends who had remained at the plane's fuselage could still see them climbing. They saw them as small dots from afar, but they were still within their field of vision. After the three climbed further up the mountain, Roberto noticed something from afar that looked like a street or road, but it was on the eastern side, the opposite side to them. He pointed it out to his friends and asked if that looked like a road. Nando said he couldn't see any road, and Antonio said he wasn't sure. But Roberto insisted that it was a road, and even began arguing with Nando, saying it would be better to go down the mountain and head towards this road on the eastern side. But Nando firmly rejected this suggestion and told them, "We've climbed all this distance, so why should we go back down?" In fact, what Roberto saw was indeed a road used by people, but it was on the eastern side. They could have reached it if they had headed east, but now it had become far from them. Until this moment, they had believed they were closer to the western side. So they made the decision to continue their journey westward and continue climbing the mountain. The climb was extremely exhausting. and took much longer than they had expected. They thought they would need 1 day to reach the summit, but it took them 3 days. The hope that drove them to continue climbing to the summit was that they would see the green valleys and villages or cities on the western side. This had always been their hope, that when they reached the summit, they would see these things. But the big shock came when they actually reached the summit. What they saw was snow-covered mountains extending as far as the eye could see. There were no fields, no green valleys, no cities, no villages, no signs of life at all. The amount of despair they felt at that moment is indescribable. After all this effort and all this hardship, the result was nothing. Nando, despite feeling all the emotions of despair at that moment, turned to his friend Roberto and said, "Let's continue, and whatever happens, happens. Either we reach safety or we die trying." Roberto, although he was at the peak of despair at that moment, when he saw Nando speaking this way, felt energy returning to him again and said, "By God, you're right, my friend. We've come this far, so let's continue, and whatever happens, happens. Either we live together or we die together." But being 3 was slowing down their movements, and in addition, their provisions and food had decreased significantly. So Nando turned to their third friend, Antonio, and said to him, "Antonio, you go back and give us what's left of your provisions and food, and return to the plane. Roberto and I will continue alone." Antonio agreed to this, gave them what was left of his provisions, and went back down the mountain. Of course, going down was 1,000 times easier and faster. It probably only took a few hours. When Antonio came down from the mountain, his friends who were at the plane saw him and went to him. He told them that they had seen nothing but mountains extending as far as the eye could see, and told them that Nando and Roberto had taken the rest of the provisions he had and decided to continue the journey on their own, and that nothing would stop them except death. Nando and Roberto continued walking westward. They came down from the mountain they were on top of, but from the other side. Under the mountain, there was a single path extending between the mountains, so they decided to follow this path. The mountains surrounding them were towering, but luckily, this time, they didn't have to climb any of these mountains. They were trying to follow the paths and valleys between these mountains. Of course, they sometimes had to climb some hills or small peaks, but they didn't have to climb a high mountain like the first one. Due to the size of the mountains surrounding them and the vastness of the place they were in, it was difficult for them to sense distance. They had no sense of the distance they had covered or would cover. And perhaps this was a blessing in itself, because if they had known how to calculate the distance, they might have felt despair. But all that occupied their thoughts at that time was just moving forward, and this certainly helped them psychologically. This arduous journey of theirs between the mountains continued for 10 days from the time they left their friends at the plane. But finally, after these 10 days, they reached the line that was for them the lifeline, the line where the snow ended and life began. This moment was like a new life for them. The joy and happiness they felt cannot be described. They began walking in the green valleys they had been dreaming of 10 days ago. Finally, they felt they had really returned to life. And even on their way, they saw a cow. So they began to tell themselves that there must be people somewhere near them. They were still in the midst of wilderness and nature, and hadn't seen people yet, but they felt they were getting close. They began to see trees, grass, flowers, and even water. Nando and Roberto say that in those moments, they felt as if they had entered a 5-star hotel. The weather was beautiful, there was water, and they even had grass to eat. They felt that these simple things, which we see in our daily lives in an ordinary way, were the greatest thing in the world. During these 10 days, Nando and Roberto had covered more than 60 kilometers to reach the place they were now. But even after reaching these green valleys, they spent one more night in the open. The next morning, They continued their journey and reached a river. And here was the surprise. There was a man riding a horse on the opposite bank. They began shouting at him and gesturing to him. Communication between them was difficult because the river separating them was quite large, and the sound of the rushing water was loud, so they couldn't hear each other. Of course, the man on the horse was surprised in turn at how these people had reached the top of these mountains, because they were still considered to be in the mountains, even though they had descended quite a distance. Of course, Nando and Roberto had no option to cross the river by swimming, because the river's current would have swept them away due to its strength. So the man on the other bank had an idea. He took a piece of paper and a pen, tied them to a stone, and threw them to the other bank towards Nando and Roberto. Nando took the paper and pen and immediately began writing a message explaining their situation. This is a real image of the letter Nando wrote. He wrote, "We come from a plane that fell in the mountains. We are from Uruguay. We have been walking for 10 days, and at the plane's fuselage, there are still 14 injured people waiting for rescue. We have no food or provisions and need help as soon as possible. Please help us. We can't even walk anymore." Nando threw the letter to the man on the other bank, and signs of shock were clear on the man's face as he read what was written in it. After reading it carefully 2 or 3 times, he signaled to Nando that he understood the situation and indicated to them to stay where they were and that he would bring them help. Before he left, the man took a piece of bread and cheese and threw them towards Nando and Roberto. This bread and cheese were the first food other than human flesh they had tasted in the past 2 months. The man on the horse took many hours before he could bring help, because the place where they were was still far from civilization and cities. The man's journey alone took about 10 hours. But finally, this man returned with a number of soldiers and military personnel who were able to rescue Nando and Roberto. These shots you see before you are real footage of the moment of their rescue and when they were found for the first time. Their condition was miserable, of course, and the signs of fatigue and suffering they had endured were evident on them. These shots and images were taken by journalists as soon as the news reached them. The journalists came with the military, as if they had suddenly appeared out of nowhere on top of the mountains. In this picture, we see Roberto on the right and Nando on the left, and in the middle, the man who was on the horse and who can be considered their savior, whose name was Sergio Catalan. Imagine that the journalists didn't even give them time to breathe. They immediately began conducting interviews with them. One of the journalists even asked them, "How did you survive all this time? What were you eating?" Roberto was about to answer, but Nando intervened and told the journalist that they wouldn't answer this question. The journalists, frankly, were not behaving appropriately at all. These 2 men had just come out of hell, literally. They should have been left to rest a little, and they should have moved to rescue the rest of the survivors at the plane. The soldiers and security authorities tried to find out the location of their friends from Nando and Roberto. They brought them a map to try to determine their location. Nando was familiar with the location because he had remained focused on the directions they had walked, as he knew he had to remember the location so they could return to rescue the others later. Nando pointed to them the location where he thought the plane was. They told him that this location was on the Argentine side, on the eastern side of the mountains, and that it was impossible for them to have walked all this distance. Nando told them, "By God, I don't know if we're in Argentina or not, but I'm almost certain that this is the location of the plane." Of course, the distance that Nando and Roberto had walked was about 60 kilometers. The authorities and police were unable to comprehend how 2 people in such a weak and emaciated state could have covered all this distance, so they were skeptical about the location. But Nando kept insisting that this was the location. Their friends who had remained at the plane had been waiting anxiously for the past 10 days. Some had even lost hope and thought that Nando and Roberto had died on the way. but at the same time, they were following the news on the radio. You can't imagine their joy when they heard on the radio the news that Nando and Roberto, two survivors from Flight 571, had been found. Their happiness was indescribable. They knew that finally they would be rescued. I ask you by God to imagine their feelings at that moment. I'm sure it was the most beautiful feeling they had experienced in their entire lives. It was as if they were born again. They began hugging each other, and all the joy in the world couldn't contain their happiness. The authorities and police called for helicopters to begin the rescue operation. Once again, the helicopter pilots asked Nando about the location, and he pointed to the same spot on the map. But the pilot said to him, "Look, it will be difficult for me to find them on my own. I need you to come with me." And although Nando was certainly tired at that moment, he said to him, "Okay, I'll come." So Nando boarded one of the helicopters and began flying with them as they tried to trace the path he had come from. The weather was good that day, but despite this, flying at these high altitudes was difficult for the helicopters. The aircraft was shaking frighteningly. Thank God that they didn't have an accident and fall among the mountains again. Imagine the tragedy if that had happened. But finally, the helicopters passed over the high mountain that was in front of them. This was the same first mountain that Nando and Roberto had climbed. Nando kept pointing downwards and saying that the plane's fuselage was below them. But the fuselage was white, and everything around was white with snow, so it was almost impossible to see. Even when the aircraft got close to the location, they couldn't see the fuselage. And here we understand why the previous search attempts for them had failed. Although there were planes flying in the areas above them, seeing them was almost impossible. Even Nando and the helicopter pilots couldn't see the plane's fuselage and the rest of the survivors until they descended to a very close altitude to them. If Nando hadn't known the place and the terrain and this specific spot, it would have been impossible to find them. The helicopters landed at the site of the plane wreckage, and finally they saw the rest of the group below waving to them, flying with joy. This is a real image taken from a camera on board the helicopter at the moment they finally found them. And here we also see real video footage of the plane wreckage. All of Nando's 14 friends who were left at the wreckage were rescued. I'm sure none of them will forget that day, which was December 22nd, 1972, the day of rescue. And glory be to God for the number of days they spent from the day of the plane crash until they were rescued is the same as the number of the year they were in, 72 days from the moment of the crash. The remaining 14 survivors, along with Nando, were brought to safety. Their condition was, of course, very poor. Each of them had lost between 30 to 40 kilograms of their weight, but joy was evident on their faces. And after that, their names were announced on the radio so that their families would know who had survived. Of course, shortly after, they met with their families and were reunited again. News of this story spread and was covered by media around the world. It became a global story. But afterwards, many articles appeared in newspapers talking about the subject of their survival by eating the bodies of their friends. This particular aspect spread, and perhaps was one of the reasons that made people attracted to this story. When one hears that they survived by eating their friends, they are shocked. Some of these articles even began to speak against them and call them cannibals. There was a great debate about this issue, and discussions began among people about whether, if we were in their place, would we do the same as they did or not. In the end, if they hadn't eaten their friends, it would have been impossible for them to survive. This story is one of the most famous survival stories that spread around the world. Books were written about it and documentaries were filmed, and it received huge media attention. Nando and his friends appeared in many interviews and forums and told their story in all its details. This was one of the biggest stories that was circulated in the media because of its power and strangeness, and perhaps also because of its somewhat happy ending. The 16 survivors continued to meet over the years. They would hold a gathering every year on the same date they were rescued, December 22nd. And by the way, all the talk we said about Nando, especially that he was the undisputed leader of the journey, all this talk was by the testimony of his friends. It wasn't him who talked about himself and said, "I was the leader, and I saved them, and I did." They all knew that the greatest credit after God in their survival was to Nando and his insistence until the last moment on survival, no matter what the circumstances. Nando, who at the beginning of the crash was considered dead and remained unconscious for 3 days due to the brain injury he suffered, and whose survival from it was something miraculous in itself, still communicates and meets with Roberto and Sergio, the horsemen who found them after they came down from the Andes Mountains. Their relationship with him remains strong, and they are still friends to this day. At the end of the story, it's impossible for one of us to comprehend the conditions these people lived through amidst these mountains. We won't know their feelings and their psychological, mental, and physical state they were in unless we were actually in their place. And finally, I conclude with a question for you. If you were in their place, do you think you would have been able to do what they did? Would you have been able to eat the flesh of your friends? And here we have reached the end of the story. Whoever hasn't subscribed to the channel, please subscribe and click on the bell button. And there are also other amazing stories you can listen to.